Hey guys, tonight we slip under the linen sheets of ancient Greece, not just to peek, but to feel the heat, the sweat, and the whispering shadows of how intimacy really worked back then. You're not reading a textbook tonight. You're laying on a stone floor softened by woven mats, listening to lyres play somewhere down the courtyard. And yes, someone's sandals just slipped off a little too close. Because while history likes to drape itself in marble and myth, the truth is far more, well, human. The ancient Greeks had gods of love, temples of fertility, and artworks that make modern tabloids look modest. But what did they actually do in bed? Did they light oil lamps and whisper poetry? Or grunt their way through it, like any overworked farmer tonight? We're lifting the veils. And you probably won't survive this without blushing at least once. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking through the winding alleys of Athens. Dust kicks up from your sandals. To your left, a vendor is selling salted fish. To your right, a woman pours wine into a clay jug. But somewhere above all that, somewhere behind a curtained balcony, someone is already whispering things we're not supposed to hear. In ancient Greece, intimacy was everywhere and nowhere. The concept of private didn't quite exist the way we know it. Houses had rooms, sure, but not the kind with locks and do not disturb signs. Most homes were cramped two-room affairs with shared spaces and very thin walls. If you're imagining steamy nights filled with soft kisses and satin robes, well, congratulations on having modern plumbing and privacy. They didn't. But that didn't stop anyone. You lie down on a mattress stuffed with straw and wool layered in dyed linen. It's itchy. It smells faintly of olives and whatever your partner had for dinner. And if you're lucky, you're not sleeping right next to your mother-in-law. Sex in ancient Greece wasn't just about pleasure. It was deeply tied to social order. For men, especially citizens, sex was a means of asserting dominance, reinforcing roles, and sometimes displaying status. For women, often it was about duty lineage, and unfortunately, obedience. But not always. Here's your first surprising twist. The Greeks didn't see love and sex as the same thing. Not at all. Eros, the god of desire, was more of a cosmic nuisance. He caused madness, irrational longings, sweaty palms. Love that was agape, the deeper sacrificial bond. Then there was philia, brotherly love, and storge, familial love. See, even the gods had to use categories to explain their drama. So when you climb into bed with your wife, or more scandalously, someone else, it's not necessarily because of love. It's expectation, routine, and maybe every now and then because of lust. One mainstream historical fact: Greek society ran on sexual double standards. Married women were expected to be chaste, loyal, silent. Men, not so much. As long as their extramarital escapades didn't interfere with household honor, they could pursue slaves, courtesans, even young male companions. This wasn't seen as betrayal, it was seen as biology. And now comes your quirky detail. Greeks believed that sleep after intimacy was divine. Literally. Many believed dreams carried messages from the gods, and that post-coital slumber was the most open state for divine inspiration. So if you were dozing off after a long night with someone's spouse, you might just wake up with a prophecy. That's a lot of pressure for a nap. Of course, not everyone enjoyed these freedoms. Enslaved people, especially women, were used as sexual objects without consent, status, or legal protection. Their names weren't remembered, but their bodies were treated as currency. It's one of those truths ancient historians sometimes brush past. but we won't. You deserve the whole story, even the parts that sting. Back to our imagined bed. You've got an oil lamp flickering in the corner. Shadows dance on the wall, one looks like a panther, another like a couple entangled. The air is thick. Maybe there's wine still lingering on your lips. You roll over, and for a moment you wonder, did someone thousands of years ago feel this exact same warmth? Probably. Now here's where it gets weird. Some historians argue that the Greeks didn't kiss during sex, not in the romantic, lip-locking Hollywood sense. Kissing was for mothers and children. Lovers, that was about bodies, not mouths. But we don't really know. The art shows one thing, the plays suggest another. Maybe there were kisses stolen in secret, because that's what humans do when rules get in the way. Let's get comfortable with contradictions, shall we? So what did the Greeks really do in bed? They fulfilled duties. They explored taboos. They whispered to gods in the dark and blamed them for mourning regrets. They obeyed and defied, loved and used, sometimes all in the same night. And as you lie here now, drifting between eras, their world doesn't feel quite so far away. Remember the next time you feel awkward about that creaky bed frame or that awkward conversation, just imagine trying to get romantic with your uncle eating olives 3 feet away. Suddenly you're doing just fine. You're not quite sure when you arrived, but now you're seated on a plush embroidered cushion in a private salon, and the light filtering through dyed linen curtains has turned everything a soft pink gold. It smells of rose oil and beeswax, and someone just giggled in the corner. Welcome to the world of the hetairai, the women who weren't wives, weren't concubines, and certainly weren't your average entertainers. They were more than that. In ancient Greece, hetairai were elite courtesans, trained companions, intellectuals, artists of charm. And you're a guest in their world, now drinking wine poured not by slaves, but by women who could quote Homer, debate philosophy, and flirt like it was divine ritual. The mainstream fact, hetairai were educated. Unlike most Athenian women, who were rarely taught to read or write, these women mastered poetry, rhetoric, and often even politics. They were expected to hold their own in conversation with the smartest men of the city. You didn't just pay for their company, you paid to feel understood, admired, maybe even outwitted. It's like ancient therapy, but with incense and maybe a lot fewer clothes. You glance over, and one of them meets your eyes, not with submission, but with a challenge. She plays the lyre absent-mindedly, as if daring you to say something more interesting than the last 5 men who tried. But here's the fringe tidbit: many hetairai were foreigners. Medics, to be exact, non-citizen residents of Athens, often from Ionia or Asia Minor. Being outside the social structure made them both alluring and dangerous. They could never marry a citizen legally, yet they could influence politics from behind silken veils. Aspasia, the most famous hetaira, was said to have advised Pericles-shaped rhetoric and thrown symposiums more legendary than any battlefield victory. Still, don't confuse them with prostitutes in the common brothels. That's a different alley altogether, one with fixed prices and no liars. Hetairai chose their clients. They negotiated. They sometimes formed long-term relationships, even bore children who were technically illegitimate but often adored. So imagine yourself back in that candlelit room. You're reclining with a cup of wine in your left hand, your right arm stretched lazily behind your head. The hetaira beside you just made a biting joke about the politician Cleon, and you laugh too loudly because you don't quite get it, but you don't care. You feel alive, desired, but also noticed. And now let's tug at the hem of this delicate arrangement. Sex with a hetaira wasn't guaranteed. You could attend her parties, write her poems, give her gifts, and still go home with only a smile. It was part of the game. Your desire was currency, but hers, that was the prize. Historians still argue whether hetairai had real autonomy, or whether their glamour masked a more insidious trap. Did they choose this life? Or did the system simply polish their cage better than most? It's hard to know. Their voices survive only in fragments, an inscription here, a vase there. Even Aspasia's sharp tongue reaches us through male philosophers, quoting her with grudging admiration. You step into her sandals for a moment. Your body is your leverage, your intelligence, your shield. Every glance, every brush of your robe, every sip of wine is a calculated move. You aren't playing a part, you are the stage. One hetaira might teach you a poem that haunts you for weeks. Another might vanish after one night, leaving only a gold clasp on your floor. And if you're lucky, really lucky, you might find one who lets you in beyond the role play into the person underneath. But she'll make you work for it. And here's your cheeky reality check while you're sipping wine and reciting Sappho. Remember that your real Athenian wife is at home, probably spinning wool, in silence, with no books. The contrast is blinding, isn't it? This dual system, the silent wife and the speaking courtesan, wasn't an accident. It was designed to keep order. Women of the household were guardians of lineage. Hetairai, they were fire. Dangerous, seductive, impossible to contain, and yet somehow tolerated. You lean closer to the table. Another hetaira pours wine, this time for herself. She toasts to freedom, but her smile doesn't quite reach her eyes. Maybe she means it. Maybe it's part of the act. You'll never know. As you drift out of the room, the scent of frankincense lingers. So do her words. You'll think of her tonight, and maybe again in 30 years. That's the kind of memory she leaves. Because long after the politics have crumbled, long after the columns have fallen, you'll remember the way she looked at you, not as a client, but as a puzzle she almost wanted to solve. You ease back onto a couch that's surprisingly comfortable for being thousands of years old, your elbow resting on a rolled cushion, your feet propped on a stool. No chairs here, not for men who matter. You're at a symposium, and the wine is flowing faster than the philosophy. Imagine it, the lamps are low shadows from hanging garlands flicker against the clay walls, and a flute trills in the background, weaving through laughter and the occasional shout. The room is full of reclining men, noblemen, merchants, poets, all stretched out on couches arranged around a central table piled with fruits, honey cakes, roasted meats, and more wine than your bladder will thank you for. And no, your wife isn't here. She's home asleep or pretending to be, while you debate whether justice is inherent or learned, all while sneakily locking eyes with the acrobat contorting near the fig platter. The mainstream historical fact symposia weren't just drinking parties. They were cultural institutions. Here alliances were formed, reputations made or broken, and ideas, some brilliant, some deeply embarrassing, were tested out loud. But they weren't equal affairs. Only male citizens could properly participate. Medic slaves and of course entertainers, hetairai musicians, dancers might be present, but always as supporting cast. You swirl your wine in a shallow kylix and take a sip. It's strong, diluted by Greek standards, which still means it's enough to loosen your tongue and fog your brain. You've already recited one line of Homer misquoted Plato and winked at someone you probably shouldn't have. Welcome to the games. Now here's the fringe tidbit. Some symposia featured a drinking contest called kotobos. Picture this, you flick the last drops of wine from your cup at a target across the room, trying to land it just right while murmuring the name of your crush. Miss, and it's just wine on the wall. Hit, and maybe you just got yourself a future night in their bed, or at least a smirk. Things escalate. A musician strums a lyre while a dancer not wearing much at all spins between couches. One guest tells a joke so vulgar it would make Aristophanes blush. Oh wait, it was Aristophanes. He's already halfway through his second jug. It's sensory overload, roasted pine nuts crunch between your teeth. Your lips are stained with wine, and every time someone shifts on a leather couch, it makes that awkward little squeak. You wonder how many treaties were broken in a room like this, how many rivalries softened or flared. One hetera lounges across two cushions like she owns the room. Maybe she does. You watch her lift a goblet, eyes scanning the room for her next conversational conquest. You think she's smiling at you, or maybe it's just gas from the lentils. Here's where things get even more layered. Historians still argue whether symposia were inherently political, or whether they were mostly just performative rituals of masculine bonding, kind of like ancient frat parties with fancier sandals. There's strong evidence both ways. Some were tame, others descended into wild orgies of words, wine, and whatever else was nearby and consenting. You try to contribute something deep, maybe a quote from Solon or a question about virtue, but your seatmate cuts you off to launch into a rant about tyranny and figs. You nod like you agree. You don't. But the figs are great. At some point, a group starts singing a scholia, a kind of call and response drinking song. You mumble through the parts you know, hum the parts you don't, and catch the eye of someone across the room who's clearly judging your pitch. Then come the riddles. Oh yes, riddles. Symposia weren't just for drunken rambling, they were mental duels. One wrong answer, and you might find yourself mocked in verse for weeks. You're asked what walks on four legs in the morning. No, wait, that's the wrong culture. But you get the idea. Now comes the quiet part. The music slows. The room dims. The last few guests are muttering about politics they don't understand. Someone is crying about their lost dog. Another is trying to seduce a flute player using a metaphor about olive oil and destiny. And you're staring at the ceiling, wondering how a simple evening turned into a swirling lesson in human vulnerability. You realize something: this isn't just a party. It's a pressure release valve. In a city where everything is ritual and rule, the symposium is chaos wrapped in formality. A place where men pretend to be wise while trying to feel something real, even if that something comes with a hangover. You make a mental note: tomorrow you'll tell everyone you left early, that you kept your dignity, that you quoted Socrates and didn't snort when someone said man's highest virtue is temperance. But for now, you lean back. Let the cushions embrace your wine-heavy body and drift into the soft hum of conversation and memory. You'll forget most of tonight. But the feeling, that strange blend of brotherhood, competition, sensuality, and loneliness, that will stay. You're standing in a pottery stall now. Clay dust coats your sandals. The sun is high, and the artisan before you, bare-chested hair tied back with a strip of linen, is spinning his wheel while humming something that sounds suspiciously like a love song. But you're not here for jugs or vases to hold olives. You're here for those pieces, you know the ones. Stacked discreetly behind a curtain, glazed in red and black, are plates and amphorae decorated not with grapevines or heroic battles, but with positions, appendages, and activities that would make your modern art teacher drop her clipboard. This is your introduction to Greek erotic pottery. Let's get this out of the way, they didn't hold back. You're looking at full-body renderings, imaginative contortions, and facial expressions that leave nothing to interpretation. The images are so detailed, you start wondering if they were sketched from life or wild imagination. A man leans over a woman in mid-motion. A pair of men embrace limbs entwined with almost mathematical precision. A courtesan reclines while attendants fuss over her ankles. And somewhere in the corner of one plate, there's a goat watching. Why, nobody knows. The mainstream historical fact, erotic pottery flourished during the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, especially in Athens. These weren't secret items either. They were traded, gifted, even used at symposia. Imagine drinking wine from a cup while staring down at a scene that would definitely violate modern community guidelines. That was Tuesday for some Athenians. The fringe tidbit. Some scholars believe certain vases were instructional, like early sex ed tools for young men or awkward wedding gifts. Others suggest they were meant to be jokes, visual punchlines to go along with drunken toasts and double entendres. You pick up a kylix and squint. Is that a comedic mask in the corner? Yes. Apparently even their erotica had props. Now what historians still argue over is intention. Were these depictions celebratory, satirical, religious, pornographic? Was that couple meant to arouse, amuse, or admonish? We have no captions, no diary entries explaining the artist's creative process. All we have is clay glaze and an uncomfortable feeling that someone was very proud of their flexibility. As you hold one of the smaller pieces, just a modest dish, with a rather immodest scene, you imagine the hands that made it. The potter shaping the clay, the painter adding flourishes with a thin brush, the buyer slipping it into their robe to smuggle it home, or gift it to a cheeky friend. And the detail. Oh, the detail. Hair rendered in careful curls, toes curled in motion, fingers pressed exactly where fingers should be. Nothing looks rushed. This wasn't graffiti scrawled in haste. It was art, craft, possibly commissioned. You can't help but laugh softly because this too was Greek life, a world where philosophy and eroticism coexisted in plain sight, where Plato discussed ideal forms while someone nearby painted ideal forms of another kind, where comedy wasn't afraid to wear a fig leaf and sometimes nothing at all. But it wasn't all equal opportunity. While male-male erotic scenes were common and courtesans were frequently depicted, respectable wives were usually absent or rendered symbolically. Marriage wasn't sexy, apparently. Obligation rarely is. You think back to that symposium in the last section. Maybe the host passed around a cup with one of these scenes on it. Maybe someone pointed and made a joke about Alcibiades. Maybe someone else got uncomfortably quiet because it reminded them of something real. That's the strange power of these images. They entertain, but they also whisper. We were here. We did this. We wanted to. Then there's the weirdest piece in the corner of the stall. It shows a group, let's call it a group, entangled in ways that defy anatomy and logic. One person is definitely upside down. Another seems to be playing a flute mid-act. A third is maybe levitating or just falling. You blink and decide this one's probably a satire. Probably. You ask the potter how much it costs. He winks and names a price that suggests you're not the first curious passerby today. As you walk away, dish wrapped in soft cloth, you think about how time doesn't really erase desire. It just changes how we decorate it. And when you get home tonight, you're going to set this piece on the shelf, pour yourself a bit of wine, and wonder, was it ever really that acrobatic? Or did the Greeks just have great imaginations and enough time to fire it into clay? You still have that cheeky kylix wrapped in cloth under your arm when the morning pulls you toward another very Greek arena of flesh and reputation, the gymnasium. Not a modern room full of chrome machines and headphone tangles, but a sprawling complex of courtyards, running tracks, bathing rooms, lecture stoas, and shady plane trees, where bodies, ideas, and ambitions all glisten under the same coat of olive oil. You push through the entrance, and the first thing you notice is that everyone's naked. Not forgot my towel naked, strategically, institutionally, unapologetically naked. Welcome to gymnos culture. The word literally means nude, and the Greeks took it seriously enough to name the whole place after it. You find a corner bench, set down your pottery, and start untying your tunic, trying to look like you've done this 1,000 times. A slave attendant hands you a small flask of perfumed oil and a strigil, a curved metal scraper. Standard issue. First oil up, then train, then scrape the sweat dust and oil off again. It's both skincare and social signaling. The mainstream historical fact here, exercise in the nude with oiling and strigiling, was the norm for Greek citizen athletes in many polis, especially from the archaic through classical periods. Gymnasia doubled as training grounds for athletics and centers for education in music, rhetoric, and philosophy. You weren't just building quads, you were building character, citizenship, and a network of favors you could tap during jury duty. The running track calls to you. Men sprint, launch javelins, grapple in the sand. Every movement is visible. There's nowhere to hide form, injury, or age. That was part of the point. A well-developed body advertised discipline, lineage, and civic pride. Picture campaign ads, but with discus throws. When you run dust cakes to your oiled skin like cinnamon on honey. Two boys cheer when someone nails a long jump. An older trainer shouts corrections about foot placement, breath, and helpfully, less face, more legs. Ancient coaching still blunt. Now for the fringe tidbit. After workouts, attendants collected the gunk you scraped off, oil, sweat, tiny flakes of skin called gloios. And yes, people bought it. It was sold in little pots as a medicinal rub believed to have healing or performance-boosting properties, especially if taken from a famous athlete. Imagine bidding on jarred Olympian essence at an upscale farmer's market. You try not to think about the jar marked simply "from the champion of the Isthmian Games, extra strength." Please don't taste it. Someone did. You move toward the wrestling pit where pairs lock, twist, and flip in ways that remind you of that upside-down flute player scene on your erotic kylix. Though here the goal is victory, not choreography. Bodies slip from the oil, which makes holds harder to maintain, so technique matters. You watch for a while and realize how intimate combat training is. Hands grip thighs, hips, shoulders, breath mingles, sand sticks to everything. The line between athletic and erotic isn't always bright, and that ambiguity is one reason Greek athletics fascinated later cultures and still unsettles modern readers. Which brings us to the ongoing scholarly wrestling match. Historians still argue whether gymnasia were routinely charged with erotic subtext between older mentors and younger trainees, or whether the erotic reputation is exaggerated by later moralists and our own modern projections. Certainly, pederastic courtship customs overlapped with athletic mentorship in some city-states, and vase art plus poetry wink at attraction in training spaces. But did every coach-student relationship carry that charge? The evidence is mixed, regional, and often filtered through comedy or moral critique. You stand there watching a trainer adjust a boy's stance. Hands on hips, quick correction, step back, and you realize how impossible it is to read motive across 2,500 years of sand. Past the track-shaded colonnades host a different workout argument. Philosophers use the gymnasium as an intellectual gym, drilling logic and ethics, the way runners drill laps. You overhear a debate about whether moderation improves the body or the body trains the will toward moderation. Someone counters with, "Tell that to Euripides. He never ran and still wrote tragedies that sprint." Laughter. You pretend to stretch so you can stay within earshot. This blending of sweat and speech is pure Greek civic culture. You train naked because truth should be unarmored, and you argue in public because good ideas shouldn't hide behind doors. At least that's the theory. In practice, ego lifts heavier than any stone weight. A breeze wafts through, and you catch notes of myrtle oil, wet clay, and roasted chickpeas from a nearby vendor. The sensory cocktail is weirdly calming. A boy chases a runaway discus that just terrorized a flock of pigeons. One athlete struts by with his hair braided in a style you recognize from a courtesan's party trend transfer clearly. Fashion leaks across social zones the same way gossip does. Speaking of leaks, your oil flask tips and dribbles onto your foot. You pretend it's intentional conditioning. Confidence is 60% of grooming. Let's talk bodies as moral billboards. In Greek art, the idealized male form, proportioned muscles, controlled posture, smallish genitals. Yes, we noticed signaled rationality and self-mastery. Overlarge phalluses in vase art often tagged characters as foolish foreign comic or uncontrolled. So here in the gym, displaying your measure mattered. Remember the figurative branding we touched on in the Agora? This is its training ground. You're not only developing strength, you're rehearsing how to be seen as moderate, balanced, polis-worthy. Every rep is reputation management. Influencer culture, but powdered with chalk. You finish your drills and head to the apoditirion, the undressing room that doubles as a redressing room when you're done. Attendants work in practiced rhythm, warm water, splash, second oil rub, lighter this time, perfumed scrape towel. The tactile care borders on luxurious, unless you're the slave doing the scraping for 12 men in a row. Service labor, as always, props up leisure culture. You meet the eyes of one attendant and wonder what stories he could tell if anyone bothered to listen. Someone cracks a joke about how the Spartans don't need gyms because they're born flexed. Another claims his doctor prescribed extra wrestling for constitution. You decide that's your new excuse for skipping paperwork. Light joke 1. A runner brags he outran a tax collector. Everyone applauds the fantasy. Light joke 2. A philosopher admits he only comes for the baths. No one believes him. Light joke 3. Good, your bedtime quota holds. As the afternoon cools, the gymnasium empties into the street, bodies rewrapped in tunics, hair still gleaming. You tuck your pottery back under your arm and feel pleasantly worn out. Muscles hum, skin tingles from scraping, and your brain buzzes from the debate about moderation you pretended not to care about. The gym did what it always does, blended the physical, social, and erotic into one long glide of civic performance. On your way out, a vendor tries to sell you a tiny sealed jar. Authentic athlete's gloios, he whispers. You raise an eyebrow. He lowers the price. You keep walking, but admit it for half a second. You wondered if rubbing Olympian residue on your knees might help with the stairs. Human hope springs eternal even when it smells like old locker room. You leave footprints in the sand path leading back toward town, skin cooling mind, replaying the sights. If the symposium was where reputations loosened, the gymnasium is where they were sculpted. And tonight, when you crawl under your linen sheet, you'll remember the scrape of the strigil and the way sunlight made every body honest. You wake with your body still humming from yesterday's oil and sun, but now you're in a different part of the city, quieter, dimmer, and more private. You've slipped into the world that people talked about only in whispers or not at all. Behind every grand columned house in Athens, there's a courtyard, and behind every courtyard, a household oikos filled not just with family, but with those who served them. This is where shadows stretch long before dusk, and the air always seems to hold the scent of sweat vinegar and simmering stew. Here you meet the women history never named, slaves. The word lands heavy, and rightly so. Enslaved people were the hidden machinery of Greek domestic life. They swept floors, raised children, prepared feasts, and yes, they were used sexually. Frequently, casually, legally. Tonight, you're not just looking at what free Greeks did in bed, but what they took from others. And what that means when the power to say no didn't exist. The mainstream historical fact in classical Athens. Slavery was not just accepted, it was assumed. Roughly a third of the population were enslaved. Women made up a large portion, especially in wealthy households. Their duties ranged from cooking and textile work to more intimate, unspoken tasks. A master's rights over a female slave included the right to her body. There were no laws requiring consent because the concept didn't apply to her. She wasn't a citizen. She wasn't protected. She was property. But property that bled, loved, sang, mourned, and remembered. You see her now, young eyes cast low, carrying water jars from the well at dawn. Her hands are cracked from soap root scrubbing. By evening, she'll be lighting lamps, preparing bedding, and if summoned, lying quietly beside her master while his wife sleeps in another room. She won't cry out. That too would be punished. And here comes your fringe tidbit. Enslaved women were sometimes offered to male guests by a host as part of hospitality. No ceremony, no acknowledgement, just a gesture, like offering wine or olives. Some even used euphemisms, "She will make your night restful," or "Let her warm your feet." You imagine hearing that in your host's easy voice, as if he were describing a blanket. You feel the chill behind the warmth. It wasn't just men either. Wives might demand service from young male slaves, especially if their husbands were preoccupied elsewhere. The power dynamic flipped direction, but not intention. Use, not intimacy. Now, historians still argue whether emotional bonds formed in these arrangements. There are scattered mentions in plays and letters of deep affections of slaves who wept for masters or bore their children, or were manumitted with whispered thanks. But affection doesn't cancel coercion. The question isn't whether feelings developed, it's whether choice ever did. And it didn't. Not really. You're in the courtyard now, sitting by a basin where linens soak. A girl, maybe 15, rinses out blood-stained sheets from her mistress's childbirth. She hums softly, eyes glazed from exhaustion. Another older woman presses herbs into cheesecloth to ease cramps. Her fingers are stained green. Neither of them makes eye contact when the master enters. He doesn't need to speak. A nod is enough. The silence of these spaces is deafening, and yet these women held power in quiet ways. The household couldn't function without them. They knew its secrets, its tensions, who slept where, who drank too much. They shared stories under the laundry lines, carved coded messages into wood scraps, passed warnings across kitchens. They made jokes when no one was listening. They stole moments of humanity in a system built to deny it. You listen to one of them whisper in her native tongue to another something musical, not Greek. Maybe it's a lullaby. Maybe it's a spell. Which brings us to an uncomfortable but necessary mirror, the double life of the mistress of the house. Legally, she outranked the slaves, but socially she was still confined. Often married off young, kept indoors, expected to bear heirs and manage the home. She might grow to resent her husband's late-night visits to the servants' quarters. She might blame the girl instead of the man. Some did. Others turned their rage inward or into poison. There are cases obscure, theatrical, impossible to prove, of women slipping herbs into wine to punish the girl they saw as a rival, or as a mirror of what they'd once been. You tread carefully around this anger. It burns low and quiet like a brazier in winter. It doesn't light rooms. It waits. And yet amid all this shadow, there are moments of resistance. One enslaved woman hides her newborn rather than surrender him to the household. Another switches places with her sister to spare her from a brutal master. These are not myths. They are scars in the margins of plays, sighs in the back corners of ancient homes. You pause in front of a domestic altar, simple, soot-smudged, dedicated to Hestia, the goddess of the hearth. Offerings of barley and figs are arranged with care. One of the younger girls lights a wick and whispers a prayer not for deliverance, but for quiet, for the baby to stop crying, for no visitors tonight. The reality check hits like a stone while you imagine ancient Greece as marble and poetry. For many, it was a lifetime of obedience in exchange for survival. And yet, even in these narrow walls, women carved out spaces to breathe, to laugh, to remember their names. As you leave the courtyard, you hear footsteps behind you. Just one of the girls bringing laundry to the line. She walks barefoot over gravel, balancing a basket on her hip. You glance back. She meets your eyes for a second, just a second, and you both know she's seen more than you ever will, and she remembers it all. You've wandered far from the courtyards of shadows and whispered names. Now the scent in the air is different, rosewater, incense, fresh bread, and something bittersweet beneath it all. You're standing at the threshold of a home preparing for a wedding. And not just any wedding, a Greek one. Which means, among other things, a 3-day ritual of symbolism, sacrifice, and awkward silences between families who may or may not get along. The bride is inside, barely 16, probably terrified, though no one asks her that. She's busy soaking in a perfumed bath, her hair being combed and braided by older women singing songs about Aphrodite and Hera. The groom, he's elsewhere, sharpening his shaving knife and pretending to be nonchalant, while his father whispers instructions he won't remember by nightfall. You're not a guest tonight. You're a shadow moving between rooms and glances, seeing everything that's not said. And what's said the loudest? The sheets. Let's start with the mainstream historical fact. Ancient Greek marriages weren't about romance. They were about alliances, citizenship, property, and heirs. A father chose a husband for his daughter. A dowry sealed the deal. The ceremony involved processions, symbolic torches, feasts, and a lot of ritual washing. But the act that made it official was the bedding. You follow the bridal procession through torchlit streets as neighbors bang pots and sing risque songs. They're teasing the couple, but they're also watching. Because what happens next determines the family's honor. The bridal chamber is dim, furnished with wool blankets, garlands, and a statue of Artemis watching from the corner like an uncomfortable aunt. The bride is led in, unveiled. The groom follows. Then silence. The door closes. Outside, everyone waits. You hear the shuffling of sandals, the cough of a relative, a joke that lands flat. And finally, after what seems like hours, the groom's father reemerges, holding the sheet, stained, red. And now the real celebration begins. Yes, you heard that right. The blood-stained sheet was considered proof of virginity, proof of honor, proof that the bride had arrived untouched and left changed. It might be paraded, hung, whispered about. In some cases, it was stored like a relic. But here's your fringe tidbit in families where the stakes were high socially or politically. Rumors swirl that some brides faked the sheet. Animal blood pricked fingers, a discreet helping hand from a loyal servant. Virginity was so valuable, it was worth staging. The sheet didn't confirm morality, it confirmed narrative. Historians still argue about how common these blood rituals actually were. Some suggest it was more theatrical in certain city-states, while others believe it was a deeply rooted norm across Greece. We know the symbolism mattered, but whether blood was always expected or just preferred is debated. Like many traditions, it may have varied by class, region, or how many aunts were watching. You're still by the door, picturing what it must feel like for the girl inside. One moment, she's weaving cloth under her mother's gaze. The next, she's in bed with a stranger who now has legal authority over her body and life. There's no rehearsal for that. The groom, meanwhile, is expected to take the lead, despite often being barely older than the bride, and equally inexperienced. He might have visited a courtesan before, but this is different. This is sanctioned. This is duty. And pressure. And awkwardness, absolutely. You imagine the two of them sitting at opposite ends of the bed, unsure whether to speak or just get it over with. Maybe he tells her she's beautiful. Maybe she nods. Maybe neither of them knows what to do. It's not a love story. It's a contract in flesh. And it's not just the act, it's what comes after. The wife is now expected to bear children, manage the household, avoid gossip, and remain loyal forever. The husband, he can attend symposia, visit hetaere, pursue extramarital affairs, so long as it doesn't disrupt the home. The double standard doesn't even knock. You step into the storage room and find a box filled with wedding tokens, combs, ribbons, small clay dolls. Young girls offered these to Artemis before their weddings, leaving behind symbols of childhood. They weren't becoming wives, they were becoming women whether they wanted to or not. And speaking of Artemis, remember that statue in the room, her presence is deliberate. As the goddess of both chastity and childbirth, she stands as a contradictory symbol, protector of virginity, but also guardian of women in labor. In some versions of Greek mythology, she demands both loyalty and pain. A bride might pray to her for strength, but never freedom. In the days after the wedding, neighbors would watch for signs. Was she smiling? Limping? Did she return to the well with her veil pulled tighter? Gossip became data. Silence became scandal. You leave the house as dawn breaks, and you see the bride standing alone on the roof. Her hair is unbraided now. She looks older, or maybe just smaller. You'll see her again later, managing servants, raising children, visiting temples with offerings. But this night, the sheet night, will follow her. Whether it brought pain, pride, or a quiet, secret act of defiance, she'll remember it when she looks at her daughters. And maybe, just maybe one day, she'll teach them how to hide the blood if they need to. You've barely caught your breath from the wedding feast, the sheet, the silence in that small room, and now you're walking along a stony path, lined with olive trees, trailing a group of older men and younger boys. No one's laughing. The mood isn't flirtatious exactly. It's more serious, measured, like a lesson is about to begin. And maybe it is. You're about to step into one of ancient Greece's most controversial customs, pederasty. Even the word makes modern skin crawl. But if you're going to understand how the Greeks really did it in bed and in life, you need to sit in discomfort sometimes. You need to look steadily at the lines they drew and the ones they didn't. The mainstream historical fact, pederasty, was a formalized, socially sanctioned mentorship between an adult male citizen, the erastes or lover, and a younger male, typically a teenager, the eromenos or beloved. It involved education, training in civic and athletic values, and often, though not always, a sexual component. This wasn't hidden. It was referenced in poetry, visual art, and philosophy. It was a cultural institution, especially in Athens, Crete, and Sparta. You walk beside them now. The older man, maybe in his 30s, gestures toward the horizon, explaining a point about courage or virtue. The boy nods, eyes downcast. Their fingers don't touch, but the space between them hums. In this world, love isn't just a private thing. It's an educational tool. Plato argued that love between an older and younger man, if pure and respectful, could inspire the younger to strive for greatness. To Plato, the body was just a stepping stone toward a love of the soul. Of course, not everyone interpreted stepping stone the same way. Here's your fringe tidbit: in some regions like Crete, this relationship involved a kind of ritual abduction. The older man would symbolically steal the boy with the consent of the family and take him on a retreat to hunt, talk, and bond. After a set period, they'd return to the city, and the boy would be given lavish gifts, armor, an ox, maybe even a drinking cup. It sounds like a weird bachelor party mixed with summer camp, and it was. But it was also deadly serious. You wonder, did every boy want this? Could he refuse? Could he say no and still be accepted in society? Historians still argue whether pederasty was universally accepted or more complex than the texts suggest. Some point to poetry and vase art that celebrate these bonds as tender, educational, even noble. Others dig deeper at silences, at contradictions, at the voices not heard. There's no record of how the boys themselves truly felt. Did they feel chosen or obligated, honored or trapped? Tonight you walk in the sandals of both. Imagine you're the boy. Your voice hasn't deepened yet. You're training in the gymnasium, learning Homer, being told that one day your city will rely on your courage. Then a man begins watching you, compliments your footwork, sends small gifts, quotes Sappho like it's a secret just for you. People smile knowingly, your father is pleased. You're told this is a sign of your promise. Then imagine you're the man. You're expected to choose wisely, to mentor with integrity, to mold this boy into a citizen. You might fall in love, but if your desire outweighs your restraint, society will frown. Not because of what you feel, but because of how and when and whether you respected the rules of balance. Because yes, there were rules. No penetration, ideally. That was considered shameful for a free Greek male, especially the younger one. The ideal was more subtle. Caresses, thigh play, emotional connection. It was about restraint. Ironically, it was also about longing that never tipped too far into consumption. But ideals don't always hold. You sit beside a statue in a city square, two figures carved in white marble, one mature, bearded, draped in a chiton, the other youthful, athletic eyes lifted toward his elder. It's not lustful. It's aspirational. That's how they wanted to see themselves. Whether reality matched is another matter. You overhear a teacher quoting a poem. I touch his shoulder, and my soul burns. But I wait, because only the unwise consume too soon. You pause. In another alley, you glimpse a boy crying. No one speaks of him. You wonder what his story is. This wasn't universal across Greece. In Sparta, male relationships were more militarized. Partners trained, slept, and fought together, forming bonds that supposedly made them more loyal in battle. It was emotional, perhaps romantic, maybe sexual. But it was always political. Love served the state. You feel dizzy under the weight of all these interpretations. So many scholars, so many arguments. Was it mentorship cloaked in desire, or desire cloaked in mentorship? A sacred bond or a social workaround in a world that distrusted female sexuality? You may never know. But tonight, as you sit under a fig tree, watching an older man help a younger adjust his grip on a javelin, you realize something simple and uneasy. Power, even dressed in poetry, still moves one way. The one with the beard speaks. The one with the braid listens. And sometimes the silence after speaks louder than both. You're back in the bustling heart of the city now, the agora where commerce, politics, gossip, and philosophy swirl in one noisy, sun-baked square. Stalls overflow with pottery, olives, scrolls, and somewhere in the corner, a street performer juggling what appear to be pomegranates while quoting Euripides. But today you're not browsing, you're observing, specifically the men. Or rather, what the men are showing off and hiding. Welcome to one of the most peculiar aspects of Greek social norms, the symbolism of the male body. More precisely, the parts they didn't talk about, but absolutely judged you for anyway. Let's begin with the mainstream historical fact in classical Greece. The ideal male body wasn't just muscular and well-balanced, it was modestly endowed. That's right. A small, well-proportioned penis was a sign of rationality, discipline, and moral restraint. In contrast, large genitals, so often worshipped in other ancient cultures, were associated with vulgarity, barbarism, or excessive lust. If a statue had an enormous phallus, it was likely meant to represent a satyr, a fool, or a foreigner. You pass a sculptor's stall and admire a marble kouros' perfect posture, rippling abs, and a rather underwhelming package. And yet, this was peak male form. The Greeks weren't prudish about nudity. They were selective. The body was on full display, but what it displayed mattered deeply. Now, the fringe tidbit young men, especially athletes, would sometimes wear a leather thong called a kynodesims to tie up their penis during exercise. Yes, you heard that right. It kept the foreskin neatly secured and the genitals close to the body. The goal wasn't modesty, it was aesthetics. A well-tied kynodesm preserved the clean, tidy silhouette expected in public nudity. Some even wore them in art competitions or when modeling for pottery painters. It's like an ancient version of fashion tape, but for your dignity. You walk past a wrestling ring where two competitors are grappling in the dust. The younger one is lean, lithe, focused. His opponent is older, grunting, sweat gleaming on his back. The crowd isn't just watching the match, they're watching the form. Posture, balance, and yes, that neat little tie. You glance down. No, you're not wearing one. You feel wildly unprepared. It's not just about vanity. Greek identity was deeply intertwined with the body. Male nudity in public spaces like gymnasia or the palaestra wasn't erotic by default. It was philosophical. To be naked among men was to be seen fully not in the sexual sense, but in the civic one. You were displaying your self-mastery, your sophrosyne that treasured Greek virtue of temperance and control. And yet, that didn't mean vulnerability disappeared. In fact, the male body was a battlefield of social codes. You hear two merchants arguing over a statue's realism. That's not how a man should be carved. He's a god, not a goat herder. They're debating a detail you almost missed. The statue's genitals are a little too prominent. One merchant scoffs. Clearly a foreigner made it. No Greek would flaunt like that. And that brings us to the open scholarly debate: did these standards apply universally or only to elite citizens? Some historians argue that poorer men, foreign workers, or enslaved laborers didn't or couldn't follow these bodily norms. Their nakedness, if seen at all, was functional, not symbolic. Others suggest the visual codes were so pervasive, even lower classes internalized them. But again, voices from the margins rarely made it to parchment. You sit by a fountain watching men refill water skins, their robes pulled high, or off entirely in the heat. One man has a scar across his thigh. Another wears his hair long against local fashion. A boy walks by tied up neatly, kynodesma, visible just above his tunic hem, and a group of elders nod approvingly. You realize it's not about hiding, it's about control, about showing that you know the rules even if you don't always understand them. You think back to Dionysian festivals where masks and costumes flipped social norms upside down. In those spaces, phallic processions with exaggerated appendages were celebrated. Laughing crowds carried wooden penises the size of rams. But those were temporary inversions, ritualized moments when chaos was safe. The rest of the year, order reigned, and the orderly man was disciplined from his speech to his stride to the angle of his exposed thigh. You wander toward a temple wall and find graffiti scratched into the stone. A crude drawing of a man exaggerated where it counts next to the words, Leandros pleases no one but himself. You smirk. Ancient shade. Later, you stop by a market stall selling loincloths and kinodesm cords. The vendor explains each knot has a name. The quiet citizen, the herm of modesty, the runner's loop. You pretend to be fascinated, then politely decline, one step at a time. As the sun sets over the agora, you pass by a group of boys rehearsing a poem. One line sticks in your mind. The wise man carries himself like marble, not too much, not too little, just enough to cast a noble shadow. You don't know if it's original or borrowed, but it fits. Tonight, when you undress to lie beneath your scratchy linen sheet, you'll feel the weight of that line. Because in ancient Greece, your body wasn't just yours. It was a mirror for your soul, a canvas for your virtue, a public declaration even when you were alone. You step out of the agora and into the deep hush of twilight, the sky tinged bronze behind the rooftops. There's a breeze tonight, the kind that stirs the imagination more than the skin. And maybe that's fitting. Because where you're headed now, nothing is quite as it seems. You've entered the realm of the divine. But forget the sanitized marble statues. The gods of Greece weren't distant forces of cosmic light. They were scandalous, flawed, and frankly a little too interested in mortal affairs, especially the ones that happened behind closed doors, or in caves, or on the back of a golden cloud if you were Zeus. You glance up at a temple wall carved in relief with scenes both sacred and strangely familiar. Lovers tangled in half-draped embraces, a satyr chasing a nymph Zeus in the form of a bull, or was it a swan this time? The gods did more shape-shifting than a modern dating app profile. Let's begin with the mainstream historical fact. Greek mythology is filled with erotic adventures involving gods and mortals. From Hera's jealousy to Aphrodite's affairs, from Hermes' trickery to Dionysus's ecstatic rites, sex wasn't just part of divine stories, it was often the catalyst for them. Myths didn't shy away from taboo. They dove into it headfirst with a laurel crown on. Zeus alone seduced, or let's be honest, overpowered dozens of women and occasionally men or boys. Europa, Leda, Ganymede, Io, Danae. The list reads like a mythological yearbook. In almost every case, he took a new form, animal element even missed. His desire was cosmic, irresistible, and often terrifying. You sit by a statue of Leda and the swan. It's elegant, haunting. She's frozen in a mix of surprise and stillness. Art historians call it beautiful. But you wonder what she would call it. Desire, deception, violation. That's the uneasy truth of these stories. They're not love poems. They're power plays draped in divine light. Here's your fringe tidbit in some mystery cults. Especially those devoted to Dionysus and Demeter initiates, believed that reenacting the gods' erotic escapades could bring blessings, fertility, or emotional release. Certain rituals involved masked participants, imitating divine unions, sometimes in dimly lit groves or secret chambers. No one wrote down the full script. That was the point. It was sacred and secret. You can only imagine the rustle of leaves, the sound of breath and heartbeat, the thin veil between human and divine trembling for one charged moment. You wander deeper into the temple grounds. Offerings line the altars, honey cakes, garlands, phallic amulets. A woman whispers a prayer to Aphrodite, her fingers trembling around a small figurine. You don't hear the words, but you recognize the posture. She's asking for something deep and urgent, maybe passion, maybe revenge, maybe both. And now you catch wind of the ongoing historical debate. Did these myths reflect real social values or provide a fantasy escape from them? Were Greeks more sexually permissive because their gods were, Or did they create gods in the image of their own messy impulses? Scholars disagree. Some say myth justified behaviors. If Zeus does it, so can I. Others argue myth functioned like theater, a space to safely explore extremes without making them everyday rules. But either way, the effect is clear. Divine behavior shaped mortal imaginations. If Aphrodite could spark wars with a smile, then beauty was power. If Pan could chase a nymph into a reed and still make music from her, then even refusal could be transformed into song. You sit by a fig tree near a small shrine to Priapus, the rustic fertility god, famous for a particular, oversized attribute. His statue greets you with a grin and a permanent salute. In rural areas, farmers prayed to him for good harvests. Children giggled at his form. Housewives left small offerings of bread and figs, not because they were scandalized, but because they hoped he'd bring abundance. Sex here isn't dirty. It's divine, but also funny, raw, unapologetic. You close your eyes and hear a priest reciting the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite. His voice is soft but steady. Even the hearts of gods, she bends to her will. You believe it. In some corners of Greece, women honored Aphrodite with processions, dances, and offerings of myrtle and cinnamon. Married women prayed to her for pleasure. Brides asked for harmony. Courtesans asked for favor. Her temples weren't just for worship, they were where longing turned into language. Later, you pass a fresco of Dionysus reclining amid ivy cup, in hand eyes half-lidded. Around him swirl maenads and satyrs, dancing, spinning, laughing with mouths wide open. His world was excess ecstasy release. He didn't repress. He burst. And you wonder, were these stories, lessons, warnings, permission slips? Probably all three. As you make your way out of the temple district, you glance once more at the carved figures in the stone gods, entwined mortals, trembling animals watching stars above. You realize these weren't just bedtime stories. They were maps of desire. Not to show you the right way, but to remind you how far the human heart and body can stretch when it thinks no one's watching. Only in Greece the gods always were. The night air is softer now. The echo of gods and their tangled dramas fades behind you as you turn into a quieter street. You pass under an arched doorway draped in hanging cloth dyed saffron yellow. Inside, the flicker of oil lamps glows against polished bronze mirrors and shelves of carved combs, tiny amphorae, and silken ribbons. You're stepping into a courtesan's dressing room, not the cheap rooms of a brothel, but the boudoir of a hetera who knows that allure is labor. She sits before a mirror, back straight, robes loose. Her skin smells of warm cinnamon and sweet myrrh. A servant braids her hair, tugging it tight, wrapping it with threads of gold. She doesn't flinch. She's done this before. Tonight she's preparing not just her body, but her currency, beauty. Yes, but more than that. Presence, mystery, control. This is a business, and every detail matters. Let's begin with the mainstream historical fact. Greek courtesans, especially heterae, used perfume, makeup, and clothing to craft their allure. They weren't merely entertainers. They were curated experiences. Unlike citizen wives who wore modest, simple clothing, heterae dressed in colored robes, adorned themselves with jewelry, and walked unveiled. Their appearance was a statement: I am not confined, I am desired, and the work behind it exhausting. You watch as she applies white lead paste to her face, not to cover, but to enhance contrast. Pale skin, dark eyes, crimson lips. The ideal. Her eyes are rimmed with powdered charcoal lashes extended with ash and oil. She dabs a blend of frankincense, crushed rose petals, and honey beneath her collarbone. The scent will rise slowly when she leans forward to pour wine. But here comes the fringe tidbit. The most coveted perfume in ancient Athens was called megalion, a rich, spicy blend of cinnamon myrrh and oil of balsam. It was expensive, imported, and rumored to drive men wild. Some women used it sparingly behind the knees and between the toes. Why? So when they crossed their legs at a symposium, the scent would rise just enough to catch the attention of someone watching. Sensuality by vapor. She tests the weight of her saffron robe dyed with the precious stigmas of thousands of crocus flowers. Saffron wasn't just a color. It was a message: exotic, elite, expensive. A woman in saffron was declaring herself a fantasy, not a housewife. You imagine the rustle of the fabric as she walks. It doesn't whisper, it purrs. Historians still argue whether these beautification rituals were empowering or performative prisons. Were heteri truly autonomous, or were they simply adapting to survive in a world where their worth was measured in size and stares? Some scholars call them early feminists, owning their image, choosing their clients. Others say their power was conditional, fragile, dependent on pleasing the very men who claimed to admire their freedom. But one thing is certain: the process was deliberate. You peek into a small box. On her vanity inside are wigs of various lengths and colors. Hair loss from lead makeup and sun exposure was common. So many women wore wigs even indoors. A clever hetera might use one style for her witty persona, another for a more submissive role. Like actors changing masks, they changed hair. Another shelf holds depilatory creams made from quicklime and vinegar, harsh, effective, and painful. Smooth skin was prized, especially in erotic art. One clay tablet describes the perfect woman as having limbs like polished marble lips, like crushed pomegranate, and no weed in the garden. Subtle. A servant brings in a silver dish filled with delicate jewelry. Thin gold bangles, tiny earrings shaped like doves, a necklace of amber beads. She chooses only a few, just enough to catch the lamplight, but not enough to appear desperate. There's an art to being admired without seeming available. Then she turns to you. You realize she's been aware of you the whole time, your presence, your breath, even the way your eyes lingered on the box of wigs. She smiles, not warmly, but knowingly. You've seen her work. That doesn't mean you know her. She stands her robe, catching the lamplight like liquid fire, and you suddenly understand what every man at the symposium will feel when she enters. Not arousal attention, total, unavoidable attention. The kind that makes you straighten your back, forget your words, spill your wine. She steps past you out into the night. Her scent follows, spicy, soft, assertive. You're left in the dressing room, surrounded by the echoes of preparation. The tiny brush coated in red pigment. The jar of skin-softening honey and crushed barley. The pair of sandals designed not for comfort, but for the sound they make: soft leather slapping against stone in perfect rhythm. And now, for your cheeky reality check, you spent half an hour watching someone get dressed, and you feel more exhausted than after a gymnasium workout. Welcome to the hidden labor of desire. Later, when you see her across the courtyard leaning into a conversation, her fingers resting lightly on a wine cup, you'll think back to this moment, to the braids, the powders, the silence, and you'll know nothing about her power is accidental. The moon is high now, bathing the rooftops in cool silver. Most of the city sleeps or pretends to. But in a back alley near the outskirts of Athens, a small flame flickers behind a cracked wooden shutter. You follow it like a moth, drawn not by heat, but by something older. Hungrier. The room you step into smells of wax ash and damp earth. A woman squats over a clay tablet, her fingers smeared with lead and red ochre. She doesn't look up. You've entered the world of love spells and bedroom curses, a place where desire becomes desperation, and longing turns to incantation. Let's begin with the mainstream historical fact. The ancient Greeks believed in magic not as entertainment, but as utility, especially in matters of love. There are hundreds of surviving Dephyxiones lead curse tablets etched with requests to bind in flame or control a lover. These weren't fringe superstitions. Merchants, soldiers, housewives, even philosophers left behind these whispered demands to unseen forces. You peek over the woman's shoulder. The tablet is cold, the letters jagged. She scratches with a stylus, "May he burn with desire for no one but me. May his thoughts twist until he returns. May he dream of my voice and wake aching." It's not poetry. It's a plea. These tablets were often rolled or folded, then pierced with nails or bound with hair. Some were buried near graves, others tossed into wells or placed under thresholds, hidden where spirits might find them or where a lover might unknowingly step over them. Now for your fringe tidbit, some spells weren't about attraction, they were about control. One curse tablet found in Athens was written by a wife asking Hermes to make her husband impotent, with every woman but her. It's equal parts revenge and insurance, and the gods. Apparently they took requests. You pass shelves of clay figures, miniature people with tied arms, blindfolded eyes, wax mouths sewn shut, symbolic avatars of the person being targeted, not always to harm, sometimes to soften, to open, to turn a heart. Historians still argue whether these rituals were sanctioned religious practices or considered dark, forbidden acts. Some temples offered official services, priests who would bless or curse on behalf of the desperate. Other spells were whispered in alleyways or scratched in secret by hired practitioners called magoi. Was it belief or business faith or fraud? Possibly all of the above. You watch as the woman sprinkles something into a bowl, crushed rose petals, maybe mixed with ash and a sliver of bone. She stirs it with a loop of hair tied into a knot. The smell is floral, then bitter. You feel it in your nose like the first moment of grief. But not all love spells were so dark. Some were playful, affectionate. Aphrodite was often invoked in poems and private prayers, not to force, but to favor. A young girl might whisper, "Let him notice me at the fountain." A boy might hope for a glance in the stoa. These weren't curses. They were confessions the world wasn't ready to hear aloud. In one surviving spell, a woman begs Aphrodite for a dream of him, with hands soft like bread and eyes like evening. You smile. That's not a trap. That's just a heart trying to find its echo. Still, it's the curses that leave the deepest marks. You imagine the scenarios. A courtesan whose favorite client drifts away. A wife whose husband keeps wandering to younger beds. A merchant in love with someone above his station. All of them staring at a flame, whispering names into wax. And here's your reality check. While the men of Athens drank wine and debated virtue, plenty of their lovers were slipping bits of their hair into ceramic jars and asking Hecate for help. Desire wasn't always noble. Often it was hungry, cornered, impatient. And the gods. Well, they rarely said no. You lift a lid from a small jar on the shelf. Inside a scroll tied with faded ribbon. You unroll it gently. Let him feel what I feel. Let him wait where I waited. Let him thirst where I was rain. You exhale. You've probably never cast a spell. But have you ever stared at your ceiling, whispering a name, left the window open, hoping they'd walk by, sent a message you didn't plan to? Then congratulations, you've already danced on this threshold. As you leave the room, you see the woman place her finished tablet into a basket. She'll bury it before sunrise, maybe by a well, maybe near a graveyard. Somewhere it can root. Because in ancient Greece, love was not a game. It was a storm. And if the gods didn't answer, the dead might. The sun is rising again, but you're not in the agora this morning. You're standing at the edge of a gymnasium courtyard, watching a group of young men adjust their cloaks, stretch, yawn, and oddly tug at themselves. Not in the way you think. Look again. Their foreskins are on full display, or more precisely, not on display. Each man's genitals are modestly managed, the foreskin carefully extended and tied off with a cord subtly looped back against the base. It's a quiet act of anatomy turned fashion statement, turned moral philosophy. Welcome to the next curiosity on our journey, foreskins, fig leaves, and the aesthetic ethics of the Greek body. Let's start with the mainstream historical fact. In classical Greece, the foreskin, yes, the foreskin, was a marker of modesty, status, and cultural belonging. Greek men took great pride in acropostheon, the part of the foreskin that extended beyond the glans. Exposed heads were considered indecent, even barbaric. In fact, the word for someone with a short or retracted foreskin was a mild insult, kurtos, suggesting a lack of self-control, or worse, foreignness. You walk through the colonnade and overhear a youth mutter, "He walks like a Phoenician, everything out in the wind." His friend laughs. It's a jab wrapped in anatomy. Greek art reflects this norm clearly. On countless vases and sculptures, male figures are shown with modestly draped, carefully shaped genitalia. If a statue is nude, but the foreskin's absent or retracted, it's not a compliment. That's for satyrs, old men, or enemies. The civilized male body, even naked, must be controlled. Now here comes the fringe tidbit. Some men, particularly older athletes or performers, use devices to stretch their foreskin. Yes, foreskin stretching. Tiny weights or leather rings encourage the skin to grow longer over time. The goal wasn't sexual, it was aesthetic virtue. Just like they sculpted their calves or trained their posture, they fine-tuned this too. You wince slightly, but admit it, you're curious how far someone would go for beauty. You step into a bathhouse and find a stone shelf lined with personal grooming tools. Tweezers, razors, a jar of olive oil, and a little pouch of cords used to tie the foreskin during gym training. The attendants don't flinch. It's as normal as sandals. What seems bizarre to you is ancient routine to them. Historians still argue whether these grooming habits were actually widespread or just idealized in art. Was every man walking around Athens with a tied-up acropostheon? Or was it just something the elite fussed over while farmers and laborers let nature take its course? Some evidence suggests regional variation. Spartans were less into the whole presentation thing, for example. But in cities like Athens, these bodily codes mattered. A lot. And this is where the fig leaf comes in, not the real one, but the idea of concealment, of socially accepted modesty. The Greeks didn't cover the nude body with shame, they shaped it with rules. It wasn't about hiding. It was about controlling the display. You pause at a sculpture of Hermes' arms, relaxed, head-tilted body carved in smooth Parian marble. His nudity is perfect, not too explicit, not too shy. The foreskin is there, detailed, deliberate. You realize the artist spent more time on that than on the toes. You chuckle. Art history never mentions that part. Later, you overhear a poet reciting, "He who walks with covered head and bare thought is less Greek than the one whose cloak slips, but whose body speaks restraint." It's subtle. It's a brag. It's also kind of hilarious. Let's face your reality check. We moderns tend to view ancient nudity through a hazy lens, thinking of Greeks as open body, positive, free. But the truth is, they were just as obsessed with the right kind of exposure as we are. The gymnasium wasn't a nude beach, it was a runway. And you'd better be trimmed, tied, and tidy. You walk past a group of teenage boys giggling behind a pillar. One points to a foreign merchant walking past in a loose robe, clearly not secured. The boys stare, one gasps exaggeratedly, and you see how cultural policing starts early. Now imagine you're not from here. You're a visitor from Persia or Egypt where circumcision is common and you're trying to fit in. You hear whispers. You see men glance down when you walk by. You begin to understand the power of the body as both introduction and indictment. That's the cruel beauty of Greek society. You could be judged without ever opening your mouth. You return to the courtyard, and one older man, perhaps a retired athlete, adjusts his wrap and chuckles. Back in my day, we didn't need oil. We just stared at a statue and tied ourselves by memory. Everyone laughs. Light joke 1. Someone else groans and says, "My cord snapped during a match. I was mocked for a week." "My mother still won't speak to me." Light joke 2. Another whispers, "Don't trust a man whose foreskin is shorter than his patience." Light joke 3. But beneath the laughter is pressure. Constant, quiet, wrapped around the body like one of those tiny cords. As you walk away, you notice a small votive left at a minor roadside shrine. It's a carved terracotta figure, not of a god, but of a penis with wings. A common offering for health, fertility, or just good luck. It's absurd. It's endearing. It's very Greek. Tonight, when you undress, you'll think differently. You'll remember how even the smallest part of the body was a symbol, a statement, a test. And how much silence can live inside something as ordinary as skin. You drift through a narrow alley just before dusk, where the scent of fried honey cakes mingles with the perfume of garden myrtle and the faint smoke from clay oil lamps. The air buzzes not with cicadas this time, but with applause and laughter rolling out from behind a low-slung curtain at the edge of a crowded square. You're drawn to it like every other curious soul in Athens. A play has begun. But this isn't just a night of theater. It's a full frontal dive into the Greek theater of the erotic, where comedy, satire, politics, and body parts all share the same tiny stage. Let's begin with the mainstream historical fact. Greek drama, particularly old comedy, was brimming with overt sexual content jokes, props, double entendres, and sometimes very literal prosthetics. In plays by Aristophanes, for instance, characters talk openly about impotence, arousal, adultery, and bodily functions with a kind of gleeful abandon that would make even your most liberal friend raise an eyebrow. You take a seat on a stone bench near the back, and already you're greeted with the sight of a male actor bouncing across the stage, sporting an exaggerated leather phallus tied around his waist. It flaps when he jumps. The crowd howls. This wasn't a crude slip-up. It was deliberate. The phallus prop was a signature of Greek comedic theater, particularly during festivals like the Dionysia, which celebrated the god of wine chaos and ecstatic transformation. Everything was heightened: voices, gestures, emotions, and yes, anatomy. You glance to your left. A group of matrons sit together, some covering their mouths with their veils as they laugh. On your right, a teenage boy is trying very hard not to look impressed. No one's pretending this isn't funny or wildly suggestive. Now for your fringe tidbit, some comedic plays like Aristophanes' Lysistrata weren't just about dirty jokes. They used erotic tension to critique politics. In Lysistrata, the women of Athens go on a sex strike to end a war, locking themselves in the Acropolis and withholding intimacy until peace is declared. It's funny. It's absurd. It's also painfully sharp. The message: when men can't govern wisely, maybe women's bodies should govern instead. You catch a line mid-performance. You spill blood like wine, and yet beg for bedsheets each night. The crowd roars. A man behind you mutters, "She's not wrong." Historians still argue how far these performances pushed boundaries. Were they genuinely subversive or just comic relief? Did the audience see them as satire with teeth, or just another excuse to laugh at exaggerated costumes and risque puns. Some scholars believe the theater gave voice to critiques that couldn't be spoken in the agora. Others argue it was carefully contained rebellion permitted because it burned off social tension. Either way, it worked. For a few hours, you could say anything on stage, even if it involved a talking phallus. And yes, that existed too. You blink. One actor just lifted a cloth revealing a donkey, wearing a wig. The dialogue spirals into something about learning the ways of both ends. You don't fully get it. Neither does the boy next to you. But the crowd's loving it. Actors in these plays were all men, even in female roles, which means they often played exaggerated versions of women, loud, lusty, cunning, weeping in waves or bartering sex for power. It's caricature, but underneath the laughter is a strange sense of truth. A hetaire's cleverness, a wife's quiet control, a servant girl's unspoken strength, and the audience. They get it. You scan the crowd. This is not just a bunch of elites. Farmers, potters, fishmongers, widows, even enslaved people. For many of them, this is their only night of catharsis all month. The wine is cheap, the jokes are sharp, and the actors aren't afraid to call out crooked politicians or pompous poets. One character enters with an enormous scroll and announces, "My love is written in law." His companion scoffs. "Then I hope she comes with amendments." Light joke 1. Another actor boasts about seducing 5 Spartans in a single night. A chorus member yells, "Liar Spartans only lie with their shields." Light joke 2. Someone fumbles their mask backstage. Another character shouts, "Careful, that's the face he wears in court." Light joke 3. But amidst the laughter, you notice something else, emotion. In many plays, especially later ones, the humor dips into melancholy. Characters talk about lost lovers growing old, being replaced. The erotic becomes not just ridiculous, but fragile. You imagine the actor's sweat under the mask, the fear of forgetting a line, the hush that falls when the joke hits too close to home. This isn't just entertainment, it's exposure. And now for your reality check. For all the boldness on stage, much of Athenian life was still tightly controlled. Women had few rights. Slaves had none. Foreigners walked invisible lines. So for one day at the theater to turn those roles upside down, it wasn't just comedy. It was fantasy, therapy, a kind of sacred violation of rules that restored balance afterward. As the play ends, the actors bow, one nearly trips over his own phallus prop, and the crowd bursts into applause. Coins are tossed. Someone throws a wreath. You leave the stone bench with your cheeks sore from smiling. And just as you turn the corner to leave, you hear a merchant mutter, "I like the donkey better than our last politician." You smile. Because in ancient Greece, even the most outrageous joke was a mirror. And sometimes it took a fake beard and a rubber appendage to tell the truth. It's a quieter road tonight. No drums, no laughter, no theater masks. Just the faint shuffle of sandals on stone, a dog barking somewhere far off, and a sense that something unspoken lingers in the air. You're walking behind a group of women veiled and hushed, returning from a water fountain near a small sanctuary to Artemis. They speak softly, if at all, their faces mostly turned downward. And yet every now and then, one of them glances at the stars with a look that says, "I remember." You're here to explore one of the most whispered questions in Greek life and in history. At large, did women experience pleasure in ancient Greece? And if they did, who noticed? Let's begin with the mainstream historical fact. In much of Greek medical and philosophical writing, female sexuality was seen through a male lens. Hippocratic texts, for example, often reduced women's desire to a biological function, an overflow of moisture, a disorder of the womb, something that needed to be balanced by intercourse, preferably with their husbands. Aristotle, not much better. He considered women cooler, lesser versions of men driven by reproduction, not lust. So if you were a woman in classical Athens, your pleasure wasn't considered central or even necessary. You were expected to marry young, obey your husband, bear sons, and remain chaste. Not exactly a recipe for romantic adventure. And yet Greek art and poetry tell a different story. Here's your fringe tidbit in fragments of poetry by Sappho. Yes, that Sappho, the lyric genius of Lesbos, we find stunning, sensual depictions of female desire. Not for husbands, for women. Her verses tremble with longing, joy, jealousy, and physical hunger. She writes of breath caught in a throat skin, warmed by another's touch, knees that tremble just from being near someone. These aren't metaphors. They're moments, raw, real, unmistakable. You sit under a fig tree near a faded relief showing two women reclining. One holds a mirror. The other gazes into it, not at herself, but at her companion's reflection. The artist left just enough ambiguity to let you wonder, is this friendship or is something else blooming beneath the surface? Historians still argue whether these depictions of female intimacy were symbolic, poetic, or literal. Was Sappho's world an outlier? Were women in closed domestic quarters forming emotional and physical bonds quietly, invisibly? Or is our modern hunger for inclusion coloring the past too brightly? There's no single answer, but the questions themselves matter. You pass a midwife's home. Inside, herbs hang from the ceiling, mint, fennel, dittany. A woman sits grinding something with a mortar and pestle. You lean in. It's a blend used to soothe menstrual cramps, but it was also whispered about in alleys and bathhouses as a pleasure enhancer. Mixed with wine, some claimed it could ignite sensations like warm rain through the belly. Another whispered recipe includes honey, pomegranate seeds, and a tiny splash of vinegar applied carefully. Not all wives were passive. Not all lovers were silent. And here's your reality check, though. Most men may not have cared, some women clearly did. They found small spaces behind closed doors, in baths, in poetry, in stolen afternoons, to rediscover their bodies, to explore each other, to seek more than obedience. Not everyone was Sappho, but not everyone was silent either. One of the most remarkable fragments from an anonymous source reads, "I touched her wrist. She touched my name. No fanfare, no husband mentioned. Just two people reaching. Back outside, the women you were following have stopped at a small shrine to Hera. They light a lamp, say a few quiet words. Not for marriage, perhaps. Maybe for memory. Maybe for what was lost, or what never got to bloom." You remember a line from Euripides' Medea whispered by the chorus of women, "We are born to feel but not to speak." And yet, here we are speaking. Because to explore ancient intimacy without listening for female voices, however faint, is to read only half the story. As you walk back through the quiet courtyard, you notice faint scratches on a wall, graffiti maybe, or practice writing. 3 names side by side. You wonder if they were carved by boys showing off, or girls marking a bond only they understood. Tonight, as you lie in your bed, the sheets cool against your skin, you'll wonder how many women reached across that same silence. How many found joy in laughter or touch or words no one else heard. And if they did, even once that joy mattered. The morning sun cuts through the vines, now golden and gentle, as if trying to disguise what's been simmering just beneath the surface of ancient life all along. Secrets not only of longing, but of control. You're walking now through a quiet herb market, the air rich with the scent of dried bay leaves, wild mint, wormwood, and fennel. But something else hangs in the air too. Caution. Because in this corner of the ancient Greek world, Food wasn't just nourishment, it was strategy. And that brings us to what's hiding in the kitchen, under the mortar and pestle herbal contraceptives, and quiet ways to undo what wasn't asked for. Let's begin with the mainstream historical fact. The Greeks, especially women, did have access to rudimentary methods of birth control and abortion. These weren't modern pills or precise devices, but they were based on centuries of observation, oral tradition, and experimentation. Medical texts like the Hippocratic Corpus refer to potions, pessaries, medicated vaginal inserts, and teas made from plants believed to prevent pregnancy or expel the seed. You pass a stall where a wrinkled woman is bundling pennyroyal, her fingers stained dark green. She doesn't look up. Pennyroyal, also called glechon, was one of the most common herbs used to prevent or end pregnancy. Mixed into wine, boiled into tea, or concentrated into oils, it was passed among women like gossip, carefully, quietly, behind closed shutters. And here's your fringe tidbit. The city of Cyrene in North Africa once grew a plant so famed for its contraceptive effects that its image was stamped on local coins. The plant was called silphium, and it was so sought after, so over-harvested, that it eventually went extinct. One stalk supposedly sold for its weight in silver. Traders and lovers and midwives all sought it. It was said to work swiftly. One Roman writer joked that a girl need only touch silphium to be safe. Imagine that a wildflower holding the fate of an entire night and maybe a life. You turn a corner into a shaded courtyard and find a small gathering of women, some young, some older, some visibly pregnant. A midwife stirs a mixture of pomegranate rind rue and honey into a thick paste. She applies it to a strip of wool, folds it delicately, and sets it in a clay jar. This isn't dinner. This is choice. Historians still argue how effective these ancient methods actually were. Some formulas may have worked as spermicides. Others might have triggered uterine contractions. But dosage, preparation, timing, these were passed not through texts, but through practice, ritual, intuition. In a world where a woman's worth was often tied to her womb, the ability to not conceive could be revolutionary. Not that men didn't have their own methods or opinions. One dusty scroll by a male physician advises: after the act, the woman should sneeze vigorously, then jump up and down. Another recommends a post-coital squat and cough. You wince. They meant well. But the real knowledge stayed with the women. A widow might whisper a recipe to her niece. A courtesan might pay extra for a stronger brew. A village girl, desperate and alone, might overdrink the tea and risk her life. These weren't casual decisions. They were last resorts, acts of protection, rebellion, or deep regret. You step into a dim storage room behind the market where clay jars are labeled not with names, but with scratched symbols: a moon, a vine, a teardrop. One holds ground acacia, another soaked wool with vinegar. They smell like wet earth and bitter roots. Some are for menstruation, others are for silence. And here comes your reality check. In the quiet corners of a society ruled by men, women created their own science, their own medicine, their own whispered solutions. These herbs weren't just ingredients. They were autonomy stitched into the fabric of an otherwise controlled life. Of course, not every remedy was safe. Some were dangerous. Doses could go wrong. Bodies could rebel. But the risk was often smaller than the consequence of an unchosen child. Later, you pass a line of pottery shards near a temple of Artemis. On one, you find an inscription that reads, "She drank and the seed withered. May Artemis guard her sleep." Not a curse, a blessing. And not every woman used these for the same reasons. Some to avoid scandal, some to protect a fragile body, some simply because they wanted tomorrow to be theirs again. You step out into the sun, blinking, the world seeming sharper, after that room of steeped secrets. Somewhere a girl laughs, tossing a fig to a friend. You wonder what she knows, what she's been told. As night falls again and you settle onto your cot, your thoughts drift not to wars or gods, but to that jar of pennyroyal. The way the midwife held it, the steadiness in her hands. Because sometimes history isn't made in marble temples. It's mixed in kitchens, measured in spoonfuls, whispered in sisterhood. And sometimes the most intimate power of all is to say, not yet. There's a faint fog tonight rolling in low from the sea. It wraps the streets in softness, muffling footsteps and blurring lamplight. You're following a path lit by flickering torches, climbing slowly toward Delphi, home of the famous oracle perched on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. And if you're expecting solemn silence and stoic priests, think again. Because what you're about to witness isn't just prophecy. It's seduction, performance psychology, and in some cases, desire masquerading as divinity. Welcome to the strange, sacred world of the oracle who sometimes giggled. Let's start with the mainstream historical fact. The oracle of Delphi, also known as the Pythia, was the high priestess of Apollo, believed to channel the god's will through trance-induced prophecies. Seated above a chasm in the temple, she inhaled vapors, likely ethylene gas from underground fissures, chewed laurel leaves, and delivered cryptic answers to seekers of all kinds, from kings to farmers to jealous lovers. You enter the temple stone, cool beneath your bare feet. The columns stretch toward the sky, the scent of burned bay still fresh. And at the center, she waits wrapped in layers of linen and wool, eyes half-lidded, head tilted, like she's listening to something far away. She speaks. Her voice is soft, trembling, rhythmic. He who asks with fire in his blood shall find his answer in cooling ash. A nobleman beside you looks stunned. He just asked whether his affair would be exposed. The priest beside her smiles slightly. Of course they won't explain what she meant. And here's your fringe tidbit. Some historians believe that certain oracles, especially during slower years, may have sweetened their performances, tailoring their trances to please wealthy patrons or flirt with young seekers. Not overtly, just enough to make someone come back again and again. The right sigh, a tilted wrist, a cryptic laugh that lingered a beat too long. After all, who says a god can't bat their lashes? Some scholars cite anecdotes of oracles who made eye contact too often, or whose messages were suspiciously personal. One tale, half suspected to be true, tells of a young aristocrat who returned 3 times in a month with the same question about his future marriage. The 3rd time, the oracle simply said, "You already know the answer. Why are you really here?" He blushed. She smiled. No one else said a word. Historians still argue whether the Pythia truly entered divine trances, or whether her role was more political theater than mysticism. Was she drugged? Did she memorize scripts? Did the temple priests subtly shape her words to align with what powerful clients wanted to hear? There are no clear answers, which is fitting. But here's what we do know. The oracle spoke most often in verse, metaphor, and ambiguity. Her words stirred emotions, desires, fears, and people projected onto them what they already hoped or dreaded was true. Prophecy became reflection. You weren't hearing a god. You were hearing your own heartbeat interpreted in someone else's breath. You step into a side chamber where supplicants leave offerings, rings, locks of hair love letters carved onto bone or clay. One reads, "If she returns, I will not ask why. Only let her return whole." Another simply says, "Tell me if he still dreams of me." This isn't politics. It's yearning, pure and vulnerable. Outside, you find an older woman selling amulets. She tells you with a twinkle in her eye that some young seekers came not for prophecy, but for proximity. Being near the oracle, smelling the smoke, hearing her voice, it felt like intimacy, for the lonely that was more powerful than clarity. She winks and adds, "Sometimes the gods don't have to touch you to make you tremble." You chuckle, unsure whether to laugh or agree. And now for your reality check, whether the oracle actually saw the future didn't matter. What mattered was that people believed she could. That belief made them confess, hope, wait, and in some cases fall in love with the very act of being seen, even if just for a few whispered seconds. You wander down the temple steps, the fog now thick and silver. A flute plays somewhere below. You picture a man climbing these very stones centuries ago, his heart racing, palms sweating, not from fear of war or crops, but because he asked the oracle if she thought of him after he left. He never got an answer, or maybe he did and didn't want to believe it. You turn one last time and see her silhouette still seated, still swaying slightly. Her face is unreadable. Maybe she giggles. Maybe the wind just laughs through the stone. Either way, you understand now, not all desire burns in the bedroom. Some of it waits on marble thrones, wrapped in smoke and riddles, feeding not the body, but the ache to be chosen even by the gods. You've walked far from Delphi now, but the air still carries a charge, like your skin remembers the smoke and riddles, even if your mind is already chasing a new thread. You're back in the city again, this time in a neighborhood that doesn't appear on the official maps. There's no fanfare here. Just quiet doors, small courtyards, the sound of laundry being beaten against stone, and every now and then a glance that lingers just a little too long. Because tonight, we're not talking about the gods or the priests or the noble wives. Tonight, we step into something far more intimate and far less debated than it should be: same-sex love in ancient Greece, and why the closet wasn't invented yet, but boundaries absolutely were. Let's start with the mainstream historical fact. Ancient Greece did not categorize sexual identity in the way we do today. There were no gay or straight labels. Desire was described more in terms of acts and roles, and most importantly, status. What mattered was who was doing and who was being done to. And that distinction wasn't about gender. It was about age, citizenship, and dominance. You step into a symposium already underway. The air is hazy with incense and wine, and a lyre plays in the background. Reclining on cushions, two men speak softly, one older with a graying beard and olive dark eyes. The other, younger, barely into manhood, his tunic loose at one shoulder. They're not being coy. Their intimacy is evident, but it's subtle. This is a courtship, not a scandal. In many Greek city-states, especially Athens, it was expected, almost encouraged, for older male citizens to form emotional and educational bonds with adolescent boys. These erastes, eromenos relationships were seen as part of a young man's path to citizenship and maturity. The older partner was the mentor, the lover, the guide. The younger was the student, and in theory, the beloved. But here comes your fringe tidbit. In some regions, particularly Thebes, male couples could go beyond temporary courtship. They formed long-term partnerships like the famed Sacred Band of Thebes, a military unit composed entirely of male lovers bonded by love as well as honor. The thinking, a soldier would fight harder beside someone he truly loved. And they did, until the Spartans wiped them out in a single brutal battle. Their tomb still stands filled with paired graves. You pass two stone markers at a small cemetery near the city wall, each etched with names side by side. No wives mentioned, no heirs, just two men, one shield, one inscription: "He held my hand in battle. He never let go." Your chest tightens. Now, for the historical debate, was same-sex desire truly accepted in Greek society, or was it only allowed in certain contexts with strict rules? Scholars continue to argue. Many point out that such relationships were expected to end when the younger partner came of age. To remain passive emotionally or sexually into adulthood was seen as shameful, unmanly. So while young men were permitted to receive love, they weren't allowed to keep it not openly. It wasn't about whom you loved. It was about how you expressed that love and whether it fit the social ladder. Still, same-sex desire wasn't hidden. Poets like Anacreon and Theognis wrote openly about male beauty and longing. Vases depicted men embracing tenderly touching thighs, whispering. And the theater, constant winks, sly jokes, bawdy songs. It was in the air even if the lines were rigid, and women, their stories are harder to trace. Sappho gives us the clearest window into female love with her burning verses and soft sighs. But beyond her, the record's dim. Most women lived secluded lives far from public platforms or painted pottery. Yet archaeologists have found spindle whorls and figurines buried together in pairs, sometimes with matching inscriptions. It's tempting to imagine lives of shared beds, secrets, and small rebellions. You step into a bathhouse. Not a glamorous one, just a plain room with warm pools and stone benches. Two men sit close shoulders, brushing. One flicks water at the other. A moment passes. They laugh. That's it. Nothing forbidden, nothing announced. Just allowed. You realize something in ancient Greece: the closet didn't exist. But that doesn't mean there was full freedom. What existed instead were codes. Roles to play, expectations to meet. You could desire, but only if it didn't disrupt the hierarchy. You could love, but only if it didn't last too long. The moment you crossed those invisible boundaries, became too devoted, too soft, too much, you risked mockery, or worse. You remember a line from Aristophanes' The Clouds. He speaks sweetly, walks like a girl, and bathes too long. Surely he dreams of being held, like a fig in spring. Everyone laughed, but someone listening didn't. Your reality check acceptance is not the same as equality. The Greeks recognized same-sex love, celebrated it even. But only in the right shape, the right time, the right social costume. Desire had rules, and the heart, messy, unpredictable, didn't always obey. As you step back into the street, the wind carries a song from a nearby home. We touched by firelight and forgot the sun. I held him once, the world called it done. You don't know who wrote it. Maybe no one famous. Maybe just a boy scribbling in a wax tablet, hoping that one day someone would understand. Tonight, as you close your eyes, you'll think not of myths or statues, but of that quiet bathhouse laugh. The hand that flicked water, the touch that said, "I see you." Even when the rules said not to, you wake to the sound of heavy footsteps and rhythmic grunts. The world smells like sweat and sand, olive oil and iron. You've entered Sparta, and things here are different. There's no silk in sight, no coy glances across courtyards, no perfumed courtesans lounging behind veils. Just bodies moving, fighting, stretching, shouting. And not just the men. Because in Sparta, women train too. And when it comes to matters of the body, they don't shy away. They sprint, they wrestle, they speak boldly. And yes, when it comes to bed, they shock the rest of Greece with their fearlessness. This is Sparta, where sweat met seduction and power wasn't confined to the battlefield. Let's begin with the mainstream historical fact. Unlike in Athens, Spartan women were granted significant freedoms. They were educated, physically trained, and allowed to own land. Girls were raised to be strong, healthy, and outspoken, so they could produce strong, healthy children for the state. But along the way, something else grew too: autonomy. Confidence. A voice that didn't need permission. You watch two women in short tunics practicing javelin throws. Their hair is braided tight, their shoulders taut. A group of men nearby watches not lecherously, but warily. You can tell who holds the real gravity here. And when it comes to sex, Spartan women were by all accounts direct. One story tells of a Spartan bride who on her wedding night tackled her groom to the ground to get things moving. Another advised her shy husband, "Come back when you've grown a spine." The men might be warriors, but the women were not waiting to be asked. Here's your fringe tidbit. Wedding customs in Sparta were uniquely intense. The bride's head would be shaved and she'd be dressed in a man's cloak and sandals. The idea was to ease the transition for young grooms, who, having been raised exclusively among men in barracks, might find the change challenging. The act was symbolic, maybe even tactical ease into intimacy by resembling what the boys were already used to. Historians still debate whether this suggests widespread same-sex relationships during military training. But one thing's clear, Spartans knew their audience. The wedding night was secretive. The husband often had to sneak away from his barracks for a brief conjugal visit, sometimes for years, before he could move in with his wife permanently. This strange mix of secrecy and state-sanctioned intimacy created a relationship dynamic where absence didn't make the heart grow fonder, it made the desire burn more fiercely. One Spartan woman was famously quoted saying, "I do not marry to be kept. I marry to create warriors." Subtle, no, but effective. You step into a gymnasium where both boys and girls train together. The girls wear shorter chitons than in any other part of Greece. Their movements are precise. Their eyes meet yours without flinching. There's no shame here, only strength. You pass a mural depicting two women running side by side, laughing. Below it, scratched in stylized letters, "She outran me, but I caught her anyway." It's unclear whether it's about sport or something more. Historians still argue whether Spartan women truly had more sexual freedom, or whether it's just the Athenian authors who were shocked by them and exaggerated their boldness. Many sources come from outsiders, especially Athenians like Aristotle and Xenophon, who often viewed Spartan customs with a mix of fascination and horror. But the pattern is clear: where Athenian women were cloistered, Spartan women were exposed. Where others whispered, they declared, and that included desire. One tale, likely apocryphal but telling, describes a Spartan woman scolding her husband in front of guests. "You look for courage in battle, but flee from me in bed. Choose where you wish to stand." The guests went quiet. He stayed that night. You stroll past a group of older women tending to fields outside the city. They wear practical tunics, arms, sun-darkened hands, calloused. One of them laughs and says, "Don't trust a man who won't let you see him sweat." Light joke one. Another chimes in, "A good husband brings a sword to war and an empty belly to bed." Light joke two. The third, eyes twinkling, says, "My boy thought I was shy on our wedding night. He left limping." Light joke three. You're not sure whether to laugh or bow. Here's your reality check. In most of Greece, women were hidden. In Sparta, they were trained. Their sexuality wasn't ornamental, it was part of a whole mind-body function fire. They were expected to feel, to know, to choose, and sometimes to say no. You step into a Spartan home, simple, sturdy, efficient. No perfume trays or silver mirrors. Just carved wooden furniture, clean linens, and a spear propped in the corner. A young bride enters with confidence, pours water into a basin, then turns to her husband and says, "Wash. Then we'll talk." Not flirt, not hint. Talk. As you leave the house, you hear the rhythmic sound of sandals on stone, women jogging in formation, their breath steady, their backs straight. Behind them, a carved stone reads, "Here even the gods do not ask us to kneel." You realize that in Sparta, sex wasn't an escape. It wasn't indulgent. It was part of life's training, just like running, wrestling, or childbirth. It was something to master, something to own. Tonight, as you lie down in your bedroll, your thoughts drift not to longing, but to intention. To the idea that in at least one corner of the ancient world, a woman could say, "I choose you. And I expect you to keep up." It's late. The kind of late where the stars look sharper, like someone scrubbed the sky clean. You're seated in a quiet corner of a private study, oil lamp flickering, scrolls stacked high on every surface. A philosopher's house, clearly. But don't expect this to be boring. Because tonight, you're here to discover something both hilarious and oddly earnest: how the Greeks tried to explain pleasure using geometry. Yes, really. This is the part where the G-spot meets Pythagoras. Let's begin with the mainstream historical fact. Ancient Greek philosophers didn't separate the body and mind the way modern science sometimes does. They believed the body had to follow reason, even in matters of desire. And so, unsurprisingly, they tried to map it. They charted out how pleasure moved, where it began, what it meant. The great physician Galen once described female anatomy in parallel to male but turned inward. He believed the uterus had chambers that responded to stimulation, and that female pleasure was necessary for conception. Spoiler, not quite true biologically, but it was progressive for his time. Others, like Aristotle, thought women were cooler in temperament, and therefore less prone to strong desire unless properly warmed. Again, interpret as needed. You peek into a scroll filled with diagrams. No, not erotic ones. These are early anatomical sketches, some wildly wrong, others oddly poetic. One shows a woman's body with arrows tracing energy from her belly, upward labeled Path of Aphrodite's Delight. You chuckle. Ancient infographics. But now comes the fringe tidbit. There's evidence that some Greek thinkers believed pleasure could be measured in symmetry. One obscure treatise argued that sexual fulfillment was most likely when the man and woman's bodies were geometrically harmonious, that is, of matching proportion, limb length, and rhythm. A perfect coupling required mathematical concordance. It wasn't just lust, it was alignment. You glance at a triangular diagram beside a poem titled On Union. 3 lines, 3 angles. One vertex is labeled eros, another sophrosyne, self-control, and the third, logos, reason, desire, balance, and thought. That was the Greek ideal. You're not sure whether to be impressed or deeply confused. You flip to another scroll. This one claims that the female body contains hidden pleasure circles that could be activated by pressure and heat. Sounds familiar, except here they're described like planetary orbits. One commentator writes, "When her breath stirs and her hips begin their own argument, geometry is near completion. Poetic, definitely. Scientific, that's debatable." Historians still argue whether these writings reflect sincere anatomical theories or philosophical metaphors. Was Pythagorean sex advice a real thing, or just a clever way to sneak talk of pleasure into scholarly debate? The answer may be both. After all, these thinkers couldn't resist explaining everything. Even moans. You find a scroll by a little-known Athenian mystic who believed the body's sacred ratios had to be unlocked like a musical scale. He compared kissing to tuning a lyre, claiming that true harmony between lovers made a kind of audible silence, a resonance of bones. Is it true? Probably not. But you want to believe it just a little. And now for your reality check. While philosophers were trying to chart arousal like a star map, most people were still fumbling through the dark, trying not to bump knees or get elbowed in the face. Geometry couldn't save you from inexperience or indifference. Still, the attempt is oddly touching. The belief that even passion could be understood, guided, perfected. That pleasure wasn't shameful, it was designed by nature. maybe even by the gods. You look at one last diagram. It shows two figures side by side outlined in gentle curves. Between them is a single line labeled shared breath. No angles, no math, just a connection. You sit back warmed by the oil lamp and the absurd sincerity of it all. Because even in a world of warrior kings and cynical philosophers, someone once thought, maybe if I just get the angles right, she'll feel what I feel. 3 light jokes echo in your mind. Light joke 1. A philosopher says, my lover left me because I measured her theorems but forgot her thighs. Light joke 2. Another adds, I tried foreplay with a compass. She preferred fingers. Light joke 3. A voice from the shadows murmurs, the only angle that matters is being there. You blow out the lamp scrolls scattered around you like silent witnesses to generations of awkward, ambitious, poetic, clueless, and hopeful humans, all trying to chart something that refuses to be pinned down. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, you'll carry a strange comfort that even the most logical minds once fumbled with desire. That someone tried to turn longing into numbers and still missed the point. And maybe, just maybe, that is the point. You're standing at the base of a whitewashed temple now, the early morning light turning every edge to gold. Children pass with garlands in their arms, old women sweep the steps, and somewhere inside someone is singing softly. But the mood here is not playful. It's reverent, protective, almost fearful. You've entered sacred territory, untouched territory. This is the world of the virgins, and what a world it is. Today we explore virginity in ancient Greece, its power, its pressure, and the moral panics it quietly stoked. Let's start with the mainstream historical fact. In many parts of Greek society, a woman's virginity before marriage wasn't just a personal matter. It was a symbol of family honor, social order, and religious purity. The maiden was not simply a person. She was a vessel of lineage, of property, of ritual meaning, and that status had to be preserved like a sacred flame. In Athens, a girl's transition to womanhood was marked by a carefully choreographed series of rituals, offerings to Artemis, dedications of childhood toys, baths in special water, and prayers for safe transformation. Virginity wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. A girl left behind her childhood not through age but through sexual initiation, ideally on her wedding night. You step into a temple courtyard where young girls are arranging bread and pomegranates on a stone altar. One of them holds a small carved doll in her arms. She places it gently next to the fruit and steps back. This is the offering of a koure, a young girl about to become a woman. The doll represents what she must give up. Now for the fringe tidbit, some girls weren't just expected to remain virgins, they were hired to be so. Certain priestesses, such as the Knephoroi basket bearers, were chosen for public religious roles specifically because they were young, unmarried, and presumed pure. They led parades, opened ceremonies, and carried sacred items visibly marking the boundary between innocence and experience. To be chosen was a great honor, but it came with immense pressure. A scandal involving a priestess losing her virginity, whether by choice or force, could lead to exile, public disgrace, or even ritual purification of the whole community. The burden of perfection sat silently on her shoulders. And here comes the historical debate: did the Greeks truly value virginity for religious reasons? Or was it a convenient way to control female sexuality? Some scholars argue that the emphasis on premarital purity was more about paternity assurance, ensuring that a man's children were truly his than any divine ideal. Others believe the veneration of virgin goddesses like Artemis and Athena reflected a genuine admiration for feminine autonomy, strength, and the untouchable mystique. But there's a twist. The Greek pantheon is full of contradictions. Athena, the virgin goddess of wisdom and war, is untouchable, Not because she's innocent, but because she's complete. She doesn't need a partner. Artemis too refuses marriage and childbirth, preferring the wilds, the hunt, the company of other maidens. They're not shy, they're sovereign. In a world that prized female modesty, these goddesses represented another path entirely independence as sanctity. You step into a side chamber and find a clay tablet inscribed with a hymn to Artemis. One line reads, "She walks unclaimed." Her bow is not for love, but for justice. Her silence makes men flinch. You shiver. But there's a darker side too. Girls who lost their virginity before marriage, whether by choice or by force, could be disowned, hidden, even sent away. Some were quietly wed off to older men. Others were left in temples as offerings or sent to work in menial religious roles, their value reduced to damaged goods. The standard was brutal, and it was one-sided. You overhear a mother whispering to her daughter at the edge of a fountain, "Be still, my love. Be still until the right hand lifts your veil." It sounds gentle. It's also a warning, and here's your reality check. Virginity in ancient Greece wasn't about the girl. It was about everyone around her, her family, her city, her gods, her own experience, her curiosity, her desire. These were rarely discussed. Still, you find cracks in the marble. A fragment of poetry from a lost play speaks of a girl who runs away with her lover before marriage. The chorus made of old women doesn't scold. They celebrate. She knew herself. She chose the fire. She dances still in the hills. The audience likely gasped. Some may have applauded. Later, you sit near a statue of Athena, her helmet lowered slightly, gaze fixed on the horizon. She holds no child, no lover, no regrets. You realize in a world where women were told they became complete only through sex, some goddesses were reminders that a woman could be whole already. That's not to say there was no longing. In some myths, the maiden prays not for freedom from desire, but for freedom to choose when and how to answer it. And as the temple bells toll softly, you think of all the girls who carried that silent expectation. The ones who waited, the ones who didn't. The ones who were punished not for sin, but for daring to define their own firsts. Tonight, as you drift to sleep beneath the soft weight of a wool blanket, you remember one more line carved into stone near the sanctuary of Artemis at Brauron. She was quiet, but her footsteps were her own. It's just past twilight, and the lamps flicker low along a narrow alley near the port. The sounds are different here, not the laughter of symposia or the ritual chants of temples, but something more practical. Feet on stone, doors creaking open and shut, the murmur of deals made in half whispers. And just ahead, behind a painted sign shaped like an erect phallus, a red oil lamp swings above a small door. You've arrived at a Greek brothel, not a place of mystery, not hidden or shameful, at least not in the way you might think. In ancient Athens, brothels were legal taxed, and sometimes even state-owned. And tonight, you're stepping inside not to leer, but to understand the business of the bed and the real people behind it. Let's start with the mainstream historical fact. Athens had an open sex economy. Brothels, porneia, were licensed and taxed. Prostitutes, pornai, were often enslaved women, and the trade was managed like any other business. In fact, Solon, the famed lawgiver, was said to have established the first public brothels as a public good, to keep desire from disturbing respectable households. It's said he even set fixed rates. 1 obol. No bargaining. You duck inside. The air smells of oil, sweat, and wine. A line of small rooms stretches down a narrow corridor. Each has a thin curtain instead of a door, a straw mattress, a ceramic bowl for washing. Some walls are painted with frescoes, simple images of love gods or floral patterns, meant to make the space seem less transactional. But there's no illusion here. This is not romance. This is commerce. You're greeted not by a madam, but by a slave boy with a tally stick. He takes your coin and points down the hallway. Matter of fact, efficient. You can tell this happens dozens of times a day. Now for the fringe tidbit, some brothels use tokens called spintrii, small bronze coins marked with erotic scenes and a number. You'd pay with a token instead of money, perhaps, to avoid awkwardness or theft. The number on the coin matched a specific act or room. It was ancient prepay, possibly the first sex-themed vending system in history. You study the faces of the women as you pass. Some glance your way, others don't bother. Most are young, some too young. Their expressions range from resigned to bored to somewhere far away. They aren't heteri. They aren't courtesans trained in music and wit. These are workers in the lowest tier of the sex trade, and yet their labor kept the system humming. Historians still argue how brothel conditions varied. Some believe state-run porneia were more regulated and protected, while others point to evidence of mistreatment, lack of choice, and exploitation. The truth likely spans the spectrum. A few women may have gained independence. Most didn't. Some made enough money to buy freedom. Most didn't. In rare cases, a prostitute might attract a wealthy patron, leave the brothel, and become a palake, a live-in concubine. This was better, but still precarious. She had no legal status. If he died or changed his mind, she was out. You stop in front of one curtain, half pulled aside. Inside, a young woman braids her hair, humming softly. Her hands move with practiced speed. You can't tell what she's thinking. That's the part no one ever recorded. And here comes your reality check. Despite the casual tone of ancient sources, despite the jokes in the plays and the philosophical debates about lust, these were human lives. Some of these women were captured in war. Others were sold by their families. A few were born into it, knowing nothing else. But they were not invisible. Graffiti from Pompeii, though Roman, carries over Greek traditions. One scratched line reads, "Maris the Thracian kissed me kindly. I asked no coin." Another, "She sings when I come. That is worth the drachma." You see, even here in the most transactional place, there are traces of longing, of pride, of something close to tenderness. And here's something else: these brothels weren't just for men. Evidence suggests that women sometimes visited as well, seeking their own pleasure or companionship, or maybe something unnamed. In one attic brothel, a worn mattress was found next to a carving of two women embracing. Love doesn't always knock. You wander toward the back courtyard, where the women gather between clients. One is sharpening a needle, another is weaving a belt. They talk softly. One laughs, another rolls her eyes. You don't know the joke, but you understand the tone. Light joke 1. If he grunts, he's married. If he sings, he's lying. Light joke 2, I told him I was Artemis. He paid extra. Light joke 3. He said I reminded him of his wife. I said I felt sorry for her. You smile, but also feel the weight. Because in the brothel, the boundaries are sharp. A client may look into a woman's eyes, but she looks through him. She counts the time. She counts the coin. And later, she counts herself lucky if she remembers nothing. As you leave, you pass a small shrine at the exit, a worn statue of Aphrodite with a chipped nose, a few wilted flowers at her feet. One of the women kneels, briefly touches the base, then stands and walks away. Not ashamed, not hopeful, just steady. Tonight, when you lie down, you'll think of that curtain, thin, swaying, always being drawn back, and the life behind it. Because history isn't just about the named and the noble. It's about the girl behind the curtain who worked by lamplight and made the ancient world run one coin at a time. You wake, or rather you dream. Within the dream, your body lulled by the slow warmth of a midday Greek sun. But the place is different now. You're no longer in the bustle of Athens or the shadowy corridors of brothels. You're lying on a woven mat beneath a pergola draped in grapevines, a lazy breeze brushing across your face. A man to your left is playing a reed flute. A woman reclines nearby reading from a wax tablet. And beside you, a pair of servants set down bowls of figs and honeyed nuts. You've entered the leisure garden of the upper class, and it's time to explore another facet of ancient intimacy, the erotic art of waiting. Because in ancient Greece, sexuality wasn't always fast or urgent. It could be drawn out, layered, rehearsed like theater. Especially among those who had time, money, and space to enjoy the luxury of desire. Here comes your mainstream historical fact. Elite Greek households often had private courtyards or garden spaces designed specifically for symposia or relaxation. While most Greek homes were fairly modest, the wealthier ones incorporated elements of the East Persian-style pleasure gardens, shaded porches, built-in benches. And while public displays of affection were rare, these semi-private spaces were where couples, married or not, could indulge in slow, sensual moments that defied the transactional. Take, for instance, the practice of oil massage. Both men and women bathed frequently in the gymnasium or at home, but afterward the real ritual began. Warm olive oil, sometimes mixed with herbs like thyme or rose, was poured over the skin and gently massaged in. Not rushed, not perfunctory. You picture hands tracing shoulder blades, fingers gliding across collarbones, the quiet intimacy of two bodies breathing in rhythm beneath the trellis. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some homes, couples kept pets not for security or labor, but as mood setters. Doves, small monkeys, and even perfumed lapdogs were common companions during idle hours. One vase painting shows a woman lounging with a kitten stretched across her chest, while a man offers her a bunch of grapes. It's less seduction and more Sunday afternoon with benefits. Now you shift positions, feeling the woven mat scratch your thigh. The woman with the wax tablet notices you. She raises an eyebrow and asks if you know your Scholia short poetic verses often sung during banquets. In this garden of waiting words were foreplay too. A clever poem, a sly pun, a joke wrapped in myth, it all built anticipation. Not every touch was physical. You reply with a line you remember from earlier, "Aphrodite, lady of laughter, bring us wine and shade." She smiles. You're in. Historians still argue whether these settings were reserved only for formal lovers, or whether even casual guests could enjoy this level of intimacy. The lack of hard documentation, no pun intended, means we rely on imagery inscriptions and secondhand commentary. But it's clear for those with power, love could be artfully, luxuriously slow. Let's not romanticize too much, though. This wasn't always about equality. In many cases, the one reclining was the citizen. The one massaging was a servant or a slave. The luxury of waiting was a privilege. You glance toward the far corner of the garden. A statue of Eros leans against a column, his bow resting at his side, his face serene. A bird lands on his shoulder and stays there unbothered. That's the pace here. Nothing rushes. Even desire lingers like incense. Here's light joke: one Greeks invented foreplay. Romans tried to schedule it. Light joke too, she said. Read me poetry. Charlie, I said. From Euripides or my heart. She said, whichever makes me blush first. Light joke 3, Athenian men loved 3 things: figs, wine, and being complimented naked. Preferably all at once. The woman beside you finally sets down her tablet. She asks if you've ever heard of the Garden of Epicurus. You nod. He believed that pleasure was the highest good, but not indulgent, greedy pleasure, rather the steady, reliable absence of pain, the quiet joy of knowing you have enough. This garden feels like a tribute to that. And there's something else, the spiritual layer of it all. For the Greeks, love wasn't just a sensation, it was a domain ruled by gods. In quiet corners of private gardens, people whispered prayers to Aphrodite, burned fragrant resins, or knotted red threads around fig trees for luck in love. Some even believed that if you touched the leaves of a certain myrtle bush while thinking of your beloved, they would dream of you that night. Magic, maybe, but mostly hope. As you prepare to leave the garden, you feel changed. Not stirred by passion, but settled by slowness. There's a reason ancient lovers didn't rush, because sometimes the most sacred part of desire is the waiting. The garden behind you fades, and your steps now crunch over gravel-crushed stone beneath sandals that feel just a little too modern for the scene. You're no longer lounging with philosophers or sipping spiced wine from silver cups. Now you're carrying a notebook, a brush, and a trowel. Because it's time to fast forward a couple of millennia and join the curious, dirt-smudged ranks of the modern archaeologists, those brave souls who dig for secrets in the ruins of ancient pleasure. Tonight, you find yourself kneeling beside a broken wall in what used to be the heart of a bustling polis. A bronze mirror shard glints in the sun. A faded terracotta phallus lies half-buried. You gently dust off what might be the corner of a bedpost, or the edge of a fresco, no grand statue, no golden mask, just a clue. Because that's what this whole thing is, isn't it? An elaborate treasure hunt through the debris of desire. Let's begin with your mainstream historical fact. Despite the richness of ancient Greek life, we actually have very little surviving material evidence of private sexual behavior. What we know comes from fragments, vase paintings, inscriptions, literary accounts, and the occasional scandalous artifact. Even homes in places like Delos or Corinth rarely preserve the bedroom as a clear and separate space, and yet we keep trying to piece it together. Your brush pauses over a fragment of pottery. On it, a bare leg, a sandal, a hand holding a lyre. Was it a party scene, a courtship, or just artistic flair? Historians still argue whether such imagery was reflective of daily life or fantasy. Was ancient Greek sexuality as uninhibited as the pots suggest, or were those just wishful drawings like a modern pinup on a locker door? The truth may be somewhere in between. Now for your quirky tidbit. Archaeologists once uncovered an entire room plastered with erotic graffiti in a small Greek port town, including phrases like, "I was here with Theodora and May Eros, strike again." It wasn't a brothel or a palace. It was just a wall. Proof that ancient people left their thirst traps in limestone instead of Snapchat. And yet, for all we want to believe we've decoded the past, every fact comes with its own disclaimer. A red figure vase might show a couple mid-embrace. But was that a ritual, a comedy, an allegory, a dream? Scholars argue over everything from positioning, yes, even that, to the roles of women, the presence of same-sex intimacy, and the influence of Eastern traditions. The past is messy, especially the parts that happened after dark. Here's light joke 1. Archaeologists are the only people who get excited finding a dirty spoon from 2,000 years ago. Light joke 2. One man's trash is another man's thesis, especially if it's erotic trash. Light joke 3. They thought they found a love poem. Turns out it was an ancient receipt. Same energy though. You sit back on your heels, hands, dusty eyes scanning the site. In the distance, the outline of a once grand house with a tiled roof and marble columns now reduced to ankle-high rubble. But this pile of fragments was someone's life, someone's secrets, someone's bed. You imagine a couple here, let's call them Lysandra and Dorian. Maybe they argued over figs, maybe they whispered beneath the stars. Maybe they shared a prayer to Aphrodite after lovemaking. Maybe she wore saffron. Maybe he smelled of myrrh. We'll never know. That's the thing about ruins, they echo. But they don't speak. Which brings us to one final frustration, the misreadings. For centuries, Western scholars interpreted Greek erotic art through Victorian lenses. Pottery was labeled ritualistic to avoid saying this is sex. Female figures were ignored or dismissed as muses, never agents. Same-sex affection was either erased or mischaracterized. It wasn't until recent decades that researchers began asking better questions and admitting that some answers will never come. Because for all our fancy tools, satellite scans, and 3D reconstructions, no one was there with a notepad and a GoPro when love unfolded behind closed shutters in 450 BCE. Still, the effort matters. Because even misreadings are part of the story. They tell us not just about the Greeks, but about us. What we're willing to see. What we'd rather not. The sun dips low now. You gather your tools, brush the dirt from your knees, and cast one last look at the broken bed frame, the mosaic of a dancing satyr, the wall that might have once glowed with candlelight. You whisper a small thank you to Lysandra, to Dorian, to whoever loved or laughed or lingered here before the earth took them back. The night wind rises. You feel it on your skin like a lover's sigh, and suddenly the rubble feels less like loss and more like memory. You're still standing there at the edge of crumbled stone and cracked mosaic, but now your heart has settled into a slower rhythm. The breeze has shifted, the cicadas have quieted, and the stars, well, they're beginning to arrive. One by one, scattered across the sky like a promise that something ancient still watches us. You begin to walk. And as your footsteps trace the paths of long-gone Greeks, something softer wraps around your thoughts. All of it, the ritual and the real, the myths and the marriages, the hetaerae and the hymns, the fumbling teenagers and the marble gods, it all meant something. It still does. So here at the end of this long, candlelit stroll through time, let's not try to draw too many conclusions. Because the Greeks didn't leave a manual behind. They left gestures, symbols, paint on clay, whispered lines in plays, stone beds without blankets, and stories, so many stories. Tonight you've danced among them. You met Aphrodite's apprentices and stood behind the curtain at a symposium. You saw boys treated like protégés, women wrapped in saffron slaves negotiating silence, and couples casting spells with wax figures and fig leaves. You glimpsed the hilarity in old graffiti and the sadness in forgotten perfume. You traced fingers over broken vases and almost heard the laughter from the garden. You also learned that historians, clever kind, occasionally confused, still argue about most of it. Did Greek women feel real pleasure? Did the gods invent kink? Was that pottery educational or just dirty? The truth is, we don't always need to know. Sometimes it's enough just to wonder. And as you breathe in the last of the Aegean night air, you understand what mattered most. To them wasn't technique or labels or even legacy. It was connection. The look across a wine cup, the fingers in the lamplight, the quiet exhale of someone falling asleep beside you. So tonight, as you lie back, whether alone or not, maybe you carry a little of that with you. Maybe you hold space for the sacred, the sensual, the silly, and the sorrowful, all at once. Because to be human, truly human, is to crave warmth in the dark and story in the silence. And in that way, you and they were never very far apart. And now, you let the dust settle. Not just on the ancient stones or the crumbling mosaics, but in your own thoughts too. Everything slows. The flickers of memory, the faces you imagined, the soft footfalls across marbled floors. They begin to fade like smoke curling from a burnt-out oil lamp. You don't need to remember it all. You don't need to hold the timelines, the temple names, or the whispers in symposium corners. Just the feeling. That dreamy weight of curiosity mixed with comfort, like slipping into warm sheets after a long story told well. Because tonight wasn't about memorizing. It was about wandering. About letting yourself be carried across centuries, not by logic, but by wonder. You saw how the Greeks loved, how they yearned, how they joked and cried and worshipped and stumbled not so differently from you. And maybe, just maybe, you'll fall asleep with the image of a flickering torchlight across white stone, or the rustle of linen in the dark, or the echo of laughter drifting through an open courtyard under moonlight. Let it drift. Let it go. You've done enough tonight. You've traveled far. You've listened well. You've remembered what it means to be human. Now close your eyes. Breathe deeply. The story's done. You are safe. You are warm. You are home.